The train from the east arrived 17 minutes late. 17 minutes wasn't much in most places. A minor inconvenience, the kind of delay that made people check their pocket watches and sigh. But at Black Creek Station in the winter of 1877, 17 minutes meant 17 more minutes of standing on a frozen platform with the wind cutting sideways off the plains, and Colt Bennett had spent every one of those minutes reconsidering every decision that had led him to this particular spot on this particular Tuesday afternoon. He was leaning against a stack of freight crates near the far end of the platform, arms crossed, hat pulled low. Around him the station bustled with its usual midweek activity: railroad men hauling cargo, a cluster of merchants waiting on supply crates, two women from town watching the tracks with the kind of practiced patience that came from doing it many times before. Steam from the station's heating vents drifted up through the cold air and dissolved into a pale sky that couldn't quite decide whether it wanted to snow again. Colt shifted his weight and pulled his coat tighter. He had placed the advertisement in 4 newspapers. Seeking a wife. Practical woman preferred. Frontier conditions. Apply in writing. He hadn't known exactly what he was looking for when he wrote it, only that the ranch felt too large and too quiet, that winters had gotten harder to endure alone, and that he was 34 years old and tired of eating his own cooking. He'd received 11 letters over the following 2 months. Some were cheerful and vague. A few were almost desperate in their eagerness. Most he'd set aside after the first paragraph. Evelyn Mercer's letter was different. She hadn't described herself as capable or warm-natured or good with children. She hadn't promised to be a hard worker or devoted companion. She had written with a kind of blunt, tired honesty that caught him off guard. That she was a woman who had made mistakes and paid for them. That she had skills and was willing to use them. That she was looking for a fresh start and not a rescue. She'd underlined that last part. Not a rescue. He had written back the same week. Now the train was pulling in, and Colt straightened up and pushed off the crate and reminded himself to keep reasonable expectations. Her letter had been honest. That didn't mean she would be what he needed. It didn't mean any of this would work. He had spent enough years on the frontier to understand that most things didn't work out the way you planned them, and the best you could do was try not to be surprised when they didn't. The locomotive groaned to a stop in a long exhale of steam. Doors swung open along the passenger cars. People began stepping down onto the platform. A businessman with luggage, 2 young men who looked like ranch hands, a family with several children who were already running in different directions while their mother called after them. Colt watched each face as it appeared, comparing them against the photograph Evelyn had enclosed with her second letter. A small, slightly blurred image of a woman in her late 20s, dark hair pinned up, looking somewhere to the left of the camera with an expression that was difficult to read. He almost missed her. She came down the steps of the 3rd car near the end of the line, carrying a worn leather suitcase in one hand and gripping the railing with the other, like she wasn't sure her legs would hold her. She was taller than the photograph suggested, thin in a way that spoke more of a difficult year than natural build, and she was wearing a good coat that had seen better days, the kind of coat a woman holds on to because she can't afford to replace it, rather than because she wants to. For a moment she just stood there on the platform, surrounded by the movement of other passengers, and she looked out across the crowd with an expression that Colt had seen before on men who came back from the war. That look of someone who had traveled a very long distance and arrived somewhere completely unfamiliar and was trying very hard not to show how frightened they were. Then her composure cracked. It happened quietly, without drama. No sobbing, no visible collapse. Her face just changed, something shifted in her jaw. Her shoulders dropped half an inch, and tears started falling down her face in slow, steady lines. She didn't make a sound. She didn't reach up to wipe them away. She just stood there with her suitcase and cried, silently, in the middle of the crowded platform, while people streamed around her like she was a stone in a river. Several passers-by glanced at her and looked away. A railroad man paused, seemed to reconsider, and kept moving. One of the women from town leaned toward the other and said something too low for Colt to hear, but he didn't need to. He recognized that particular kind of look, the one that was already forming a story about a stranger before it had any of the facts. Colt stood where he was for a moment longer. He'd been expecting someone practical, prepared, a woman who would step off the train and look around with assessment in her eyes, taking stock of the situation the way you'd take stock of a piece of land you were considering. He hadn't been expecting this, but he picked up his hat from the top of the crate and walked toward her anyway. She heard him coming, or maybe she just sensed that someone had stopped in front of her rather than moving around, and she lifted her face and pulled her expression back together with an effort that was almost visible. Her eyes were dark, red at the edges now from crying, and they fixed on him with a look that was equal parts mortification and defiance. "Miss Mercer," he said. He kept his voice even, like this was entirely ordinary. "Mr. Bennett?" Her voice was steadier than he expected, a little rough at the edges. "I apologize, This isn't..." She stopped, tried again. "I don't usually..." "You don't have to explain." "I've been on the train for 4 days," she said, as if that clarified something. "I know." He looked at the suitcase in her hand. "Is this everything?" She glanced down at it like she'd briefly forgotten she was holding it. "Yes." Colt reached out and took it from her. She let him, which he figured meant she was more exhausted than she was proud. The suitcase was lighter than it should have been for a woman planning to start a new life. Whatever she'd come from, she hadn't been able to bring much of it with her. "Wagon's out front," he said. "We've got about 2 hours of daylight left." She nodded and straightened up and fell into step beside him, and that was how they began. Dear. He noticed things about her in the first hour, quietly and without comment. She was observant in a way that didn't announce itself. She catalogued the station, the town beyond it, the faces of people they passed with small, precise movements of her eyes. She asked one question and one question only as they crossed from the platform toward the street. "How far is the ranch from town?" Not "what is the town like?" or "are the people friendly?" or any of the dozen softer questions a person might ask. Distance, practicality, the reflex of someone already thinking about logistics. He told her 20 minutes in good weather, longer in bad. She nodded and filed it away and didn't ask anything else. The town of Black Creek was not impressive. A single main street with buildings crowded close together against the cold. Most of them built fast and functional with little thought for appearance. A general store, a hardware supplier, a land office, the saloon that was always the tallest building in any frontier town. For some reason, Colt had never fully understood. A small school that doubled as a meeting hall. The station sat at the eastern edge of town, and the wagon was parked on the street just beyond the main platform entrance. Evelyn climbed up onto the wagon seat without assistance or comment. He noted that too. He stowed her suitcase in the bed and got up beside her and turned the horses toward the road west. For a while, neither of them said anything. The wind had picked up, coming down off the higher ground to the north, carrying the particular kind of cold that got into your coat rather than just pressing against it. The last of the afternoon light was already beginning to thin out across the plains. "You're not going to ask me about it," she said eventually. Colt glanced at her. "About what?" "About why I was..." She made a small gesture that seemed to stand in for crying on a train platform in front of strangers. "At the station." "No." She looked at him directly for the first time, with something that was not quite suspicion and not quite relief. "Why not?" He considered this. "Because you'll tell me when you decide to," he said, "or you won't. Either way, it doesn't change where we're going." Another silence. The horses moved steadily, their breath misting in the cold air. Somewhere off to the left, a hawk circled once over the dead grass and then dropped out of sight. "That's an unusual perspective," Evelyn said. "Maybe." She turned back to look at the road ahead of them. "The man who ruined my reputation was a banker," she said, without preamble, without softening it. "His name doesn't matter. He made certain claims about me. In the kind of circles I worked in, claims like that don't require proof to destroy a person. I lost my position. I lost the lodgings that came with it. I had 2 friends who were willing to be seen with me after, and within 3 months of the whole business, one of them moved away and the other stopped answering my letters." She said all of this in the same flat, controlled tone someone might use to describe weather. "So I answered your advertisement." Colt drove in silence for a moment. "I'm sorry that happened," he said. "I'm not telling you for sympathy." She said it without sharpness, just matter of fact. "I'm telling you because you're going to hear things eventually. In a town this size, people will dig, and I'd rather you heard it from me first." "All right." "The accusations were false," she added. Then after a beat, "I don't expect you to take my word for that." "I'll take your word for it," he said. She turned to look at him again. This time the look was harder to read. Something working its way through her expression that wasn't quite gratitude and wasn't quite disbelief. More like a woman who had braced for a wall and walked through a door instead, and wasn't sure yet what room she was standing in. "You don't know me," she said. "No," he agreed. "But you told me the difficult thing before I asked for it. That counts for something." Quote. The ranch house appeared at the end of a long unpaved track, low and solid against the darkening sky. It was not a beautiful building. Colt hadn't built it for beauty, but it had the look of something that meant to stay standing. Stone foundation, thick walls, small windows set deep against the wind. A barn to one side, a fenced paddock beyond that. A wood stack near the south wall that was already being reduced by November but was still substantial. Evelyn studied it as they came up the track. "It's real," she said, half under her breath, like she'd been expecting something else, or nothing at all. "What did you think it would be?" "I didn't let myself think," she said. "It seemed safer not to." He brought the wagon to a stop near the barn and set the brake and climbed down. She was down before he reached her side, not making a point of it, just moving with the automatic efficiency of someone who had learned not to wait to be helped. He noted that and said nothing about it. Inside, the house was spare and clean in the way of a man who didn't own much and kept what he had in order. A main room with a hearth at one end and a table and 2 chairs at the other. A small kitchen through a narrow doorway, practical and arranged without sentiment. A short hall leading to 2 rooms at the back. One was clearly his. The door was open and she could see the edge of a made bed and a pair of boots on the floor. The other door was closed. Colt set her suitcase down in the main room and moved to get the fire going. "That's yours," he said, nodding toward the closed door. "If you want to look." She opened it. A small room, a bed with a plain quilt, a washstand with a basin, a hook on the wall, a window that looked out toward the barn. Nothing else. Not comfortable, not uncomfortable, simply a room. "It's fine," she said. "Sheets are clean." He said it a little defensively, which surprised him. He had changed them twice in the past week, certain that was excessive, and then doing it again anyway. "I can tell." She came back out into the main room and stood near the hearth, which was beginning to throw real heat. She still had her coat on. "Thank you." "There's food in the kitchen. It's not—" He stopped. "I'm not a good cook." Something shifted at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile, but in that direction. "I am," she said. "Or I was. I haven't had a proper kitchen in some time." "You're welcome to it." She looked around the main room once more. The table, the 2 chairs, the frost on the window glass, the fire that was finally catching, taking stock of it in that precise, quiet way of hers. "I need to tell you something else," she said, "before we go any further." Colt, who had been crouching by the hearth, straightened up and turned. "I'm not fragile," Evelyn said. "I was. I think I was, for a while, after everything that happened. But I'm not anymore. And I need you to know that because I don't want you treating me like I might break. I came here to work. Whatever this," she gestured vaguely between them, "turns out to be, I'm not a guest you have to manage. I'm a partner, or I'm not here at all. Those are the terms I'm offering." He looked at her for a long moment. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind pushed against the window glass. "That's fair," he said. "Good." She unbelted her coat and hung it on the hook beside the door. Underneath, she was wearing a dark dress that had the look of her best one, worn carefully for the occasion of arriving. Her hands, he noticed, were not soft hands. They had the look of someone who had been doing manual work for some time. "Then show me where you keep the stores, and let's see what we can make of supper." Chem. They ate together that first night at the small table, a simple meal of beans and salt pork and cornbread that Evelyn made quickly and without ceremony, navigating his kitchen in the careful way of someone mapping unfamiliar territory. The food was plain, but better than anything he'd cooked for himself in months. The conversation was slow and intermittent, the kind that happens between 2 people who are both tired and cautious and haven't yet found the rhythm of talking to each other. But it was there, working its way through the silences. She asked about the ranch's land, how many head of cattle, whether the winter had been bad so far this year. Practical questions, all of them. He answered honestly, including the parts that weren't reassuring. That the past summer had been dry, that he'd lost 3 head to illness in September, that he owed the hardware supply for materials he'd used to repair the north fence before the ground froze. She listened without interrupting. "That's the kind of thing most men wouldn't admit to a woman they just met," she said, when he'd finished. "I figured you'd see it for yourself soon enough," he said. "Better you hear it straight." She looked at him across the table. "You're different from what I expected." "What did you expect?" "I don't know exactly." She turned her spoon over in her hand. "Someone who needed a cook and didn't want to say so. Someone who would look at me like a transaction he'd made and was hoping not to regret." "Is that what it feels like?" "No," she said, and she said it simply without elaborating. She set her spoon down and pushed her chair back slightly from the table. "I'll clean up." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." She stood and gathered the dishes. "I want to. It gives me something to do with my hands." He let her, because he understood that particular need. The days that followed were hard in ways that were predictable and hard in ways that weren't. Evelyn had not grown up doing ranch work. She had been raised in a city, Philadelphia, though she only mentioned it once and in passing, and her practical experience was with a different kind of labor. She had worked as a bookkeeper, and before that a secretary, and before that a dozen other things since she was 15, and she was not weak and she was not uncoordinated, but hauling water from the well in below-freezing temperatures was a different category of difficulty than any of that. The first morning she came back inside after the morning chores with her coat soaked through on the left side where she'd misjudged the carry distance and sloshed water down herself, and she stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at him with an expression that dared him to comment. He didn't comment. She changed and went back out and did it again. By the third day she had figured out the angle and the stride and was managing it without soaking herself. By the end of the first week she was fast enough that he stopped worrying about her completing it before the horses needed tending. She was, he noticed, someone who learned by doing and who did not ask for more help than she strictly needed. She watched how he did things, the way he checked the livestock, the order he moved through the morning tasks, the particular method he used for repairing fence line, and she filed it away and applied it without comment. She made mistakes and corrected them without drama. When something went wrong, she fixed it and moved on. She also had opinions, which became clear by the end of the first week. "Your supply rotation is wrong," she said one evening, sitting at the table where she'd been reviewing the small stack of household accounts he kept in a tin box by the window. He looked up from the leather harness he was mending. "How do you mean?" "You're running low on salt and you don't know it because you're not tracking consumption against what you bring in from town." "By my count," she tapped the paper in front of her, "you'll be short before January." He thought about it. "I go by feel." "You go by memory," she corrected. "And memory is fine until it isn't. If you'd let me keep the accounts properly, I can tell you what we need to order and when before it becomes a problem." He set the harness down. "You did bookkeeping for 8 years, then for an additional 2 after I was supposed to have stopped." She said the last part with a dry flatness that told him there was a longer story there, and she wasn't in the mood to tell it tonight. "All right," he said. "They're yours." She took the tin box to her room that night, and he found the next morning that she had reorganized and annotated the entire contents in a neat, precise hand that was far more legible than his own. The trouble started about 10 days after she arrived. He should have expected it. He supposed, thinking about it later, that some part of him had expected it, which was why he'd taken the back way through town the day he picked her up, why he'd kept to himself about the advertisement until the last minute. But in a town the size of Black Creek, privacy was a temporary condition at best. The man's name was Silas Grady. He owned a significant portion of land to the east of town, had arrived in the territory 2 years before Colt did, and had built his operation with the kind of aggressive expansion that came from treating every neighboring property as a potential acquisition. He was not someone Colt had ever had direct trouble with. Their land didn't border, their business interests didn't overlap, but he was the kind of man who always knew everyone's business, and had a particular instinct for finding the parts of it that could be leveraged. He found out about Evelyn the way everyone found out about everything in Black Creek, through the station master, who had remarked to someone that Colt Bennett had picked up a woman from the train, and that someone had remarked to someone else. And within a week there was a general awareness around town that Colt had sent east for a wife and that she had arrived. That, by itself, would have been unremarkable. People got mail-order brides. It wasn't exactly celebrated, but it wasn't scandalous either. What Silas found, Colt only learned about secondhand through the hardware man who mentioned it carefully and with evident discomfort while Colt was picking up nails the following Thursday. "There's talk going around," the hardware man said, not meeting his eyes. "About the woman you brought in." Colt set the nails down on the counter. "What kind of talk?" "The kind that came from somewhere." The hardware man looked like he'd rather be somewhere else. "Somebody found out she left Philadelphia under circumstances. Said she was dismissed from a position there. Said it was because of, He stopped, cleared his throat. "Conduct unbecoming." Colt looked at him steadily. "Who said it?" "It's around is all. Can't pin it to one person." The hardware man finally looked up. "I'm not saying I believe it. I'm saying you ought to know it's circulating." Colt paid for his nails and drove back to the ranch without stopping anywhere else in town. He told Evelyn that evening. She was at the table with the accounts when he came in, and she looked up at his expression and went still before he'd said a word. "Someone's found something," she said. Not a question. He sat down across from her and told her what the hardware man had said. She listened without interrupting, with that same precise, controlled stillness she'd shown on the platform the day she arrived. The kind of stillness that was holding something in, not the kind that came from having nothing to feel. When he was done, she set her pen down very carefully. "How bad is it?" she asked. "I don't know yet. It's early. In my experience—" She started, then stopped. Started again. "In my experience, it doesn't stay early for long. Once something like this starts moving, it accelerates." Her voice was steady, but her hands weren't quite. She had her fingers laced together on the table, and he could see the knuckle pressure from where he was sitting. "This is how it happened in Philadelphia. Small things first. Then it becomes the story everyone's already decided is true before you've had a chance to say a word. This isn't Philadelphia." "No," she said. "It's smaller, which means there are fewer people to convince and less room to run." She looked down at her locked hands. "I should have expected this. I suppose I thought that if I got far enough away." "Did you do what they said?" She raised her eyes to him. "No." "Then that's the answer." He said it without emphasis, just a fact. It wasn't the answer in Philadelphia. "I'm not asking what happened in Philadelphia." He leaned forward slightly. "I'm asking if you're ready for a fight, because that's what this is going to be. Not today, maybe, but this kind of thing. You either stand up to it or you let it run you. And I've watched it run people." She looked at him for a long moment. Something moved through her expression. Not relief, not courage, not hope, exactly. More like the slow resettlement of a person who has been braced for a blow and is reconsidering their stance. "I'm tired of running," she said. "All right, then. I'm not saying I'm not frightened." "Being frightened and being ready aren't the same thing," he said. She unclenched her hands and picked up her pen and looked back down at the accounts. Her expression had changed, not dramatically, not in a way that transformed anything, but something had settled in her jaw that hadn't been there before. "We're going to need extra salt by January," she said. "We should add it to the town order." He got up and started building the evening fire. "I'll put it on the list," he said. Ooh. Over the following weeks, Black Creek conducted its quiet assessment of Evelyn Mercer with the thoroughness that only small, isolated communities are truly capable of. It wasn't hostile, exactly. Not openly, not at first. It was more like the careful, collective attention of people who had few entertainments and a well-developed instinct for anything new or irregular. Evelyn was new and irregular on multiple counts, and the rumors that Silas had set moving gave the town something to measure her against before she'd had the chance to make her own impression. She came to town with Colt for the first time about 2 weeks after arriving. He tried to manage it, so it happened naturally. A supply run he genuinely needed to make, rather than having the quality of a formal presentation. But there was no way to make it not a thing. People noticed. They noticed from across the street, from behind store windows, from the doorway of the feed store where two men stopped their conversation entirely to watch as she climbed down from the wagon with that particular careful competence of hers and walked beside Colt toward the general store. Inside, the storekeeper's wife, a woman named Harriet Doyle, who had strong opinions about everything and wasn't accustomed to keeping them to herself, looked Evelyn over with a comprehensive efficiency and then looked at Colt. "This is her, then," Harriet said. Not unkindly, not kindly either, simply as a statement of observation. This is Evelyn, Colt said. My wife. He hadn't called her that before, even to her directly. They hadn't had the ceremony yet, hadn't really discussed the timing of it, and Evelyn didn't flinch, which he appreciated. Evelyn, Harriet repeated. She looked at her directly now. You from back east? Philadelphia, Evelyn said. Long way. Yes. Harriet seemed to be waiting for something more. When nothing more came, she turned to get their order started with the air of a woman who had not finished forming her opinions, but was willing to postpone the process temporarily. At the dry goods counter, while Colt was dealing with the feed order in the back, a younger woman came to stand near Evelyn while pretending to examine bolts of fabric. She was maybe 22, with a friendly open face that she was trying to make less friendly, and wasn't quite succeeding. It's Lucy Walsh, the young woman said, giving up on the pretense. I work over at the seamstress. I'm not supposed to... She glanced toward the back of the store. Well, people are being careful, but you seem all right. Evelyn looked at her. People are being careful because of what they've heard. Lucy's expression confirmed it without her having to say so. People hear things. They don't always check. No, Evelyn agreed. They don't. Was any of it true? Lucy asked, and then seemed to immediately regret it, clapping her hand over her mouth. I'm sorry. That's not. I shouldn't have. It's fine. Evelyn considered for a moment. No, it wasn't true. It was a story someone told because it was useful to him. That's how it works sometimes. Lucy lowered her hand. She was quiet for a second, absorbing this. That's terrible, she said, with the direct sincerity of someone who hadn't yet learned to muffle their reactions. Yes, Evelyn said. It is. They looked at each other for a moment. Then Lucy said, We have fabric that would suit you, the blue wool, if you're looking to make something warm. It's just come in. It wasn't friendship, not yet, but it was something, and Evelyn recognized it as such. The thing about frontier life that she hadn't anticipated, not fully, in the way you couldn't fully anticipate something until you were inside it, was how physical it was. Not just demanding, but physical in a way that was constant and unmistakable. Every hour of every day, your body was involved in the work of surviving. Hauling, lifting, walking, cutting, building, mending, managing animals that were larger than you and had their own ideas about things. She had been strong before, in a different way. The strength of long hours and careful attention and the ability to hold herself together under pressure. But this was different. This was muscle and callous and learning to read the weather and the color of the afternoon sky. She fell into it. Not easily. There was nothing easy about it, but with a kind of grim determination that surprised even herself. The first time she spent an entire day helping Colt repair fencing in temperatures that should have sent her inside, she went to bed so sore she could barely turn over in the night. The next day she got up and did it again. Not because she was trying to prove something, simply because it needed doing, and she was there. Colt noticed, and what he noticed, he seemed to respect, though he didn't say so in as many words. He was not a man who translated internal observations into speech unless he'd thought them through thoroughly. She had figured that out by the end of the first week. He noticed things carefully and spoke about them deliberately, and the gap between the two was sometimes significant. But there were small things. He started leaving the better of the 2 pairs of work gloves for her rather than taking them himself. He calibrated the morning tasks without discussing it, so that the ones that required height defaulted to him and the ones that required precision or speed increasingly fell to her. Not because he made a decision and announced it, but because that was how things sorted themselves when 2 people worked together long enough without getting in each other's way. One afternoon near the end of November, she was in the barn working on the tack, cleaning and conditioning harness leather, a task she'd learned primarily by watching him do it once and then asking a couple of precise questions, when he came in from checking the north fence and stood in the doorway for a moment looking at her. "You're doing that wrong," he said. She looked up. "How?" He came over and showed her, not taking the leather from her, but demonstrating the motion beside her, the direction and pressure that worked with the grain rather than against it. She watched and adjusted, and he watched her adjust. "Better," he said. "You could have said something the first time." I didn't think you'd take instruction then. She looked at him sideways. And you thought I would now? I thought there was a better chance. He reached past her for a different brush from the shelf, his shoulder briefly close to hers in the narrow space. You asked more questions this week. I ask questions when I trust that the answer isn't going to be used against me, she said. He was quiet for a moment. That's a specific kind of caution. It's a learned one. He went back to work on the fence post he'd brought in to repair, and neither of them said anything for a while. Outside the barn, the wind had picked up, pushing around the corner of the building with a low, persistent sound. And inside it was dimly lit and warmer than the house at this time of day, the horses breathing slow and heavy in their stalls. The banker, he said eventually, the one who started the whole thing. She didn't look up from the harness. What about him? Did you ever think about going back? After. Making it right somehow. For about a week, she said. Then I understood that there was nothing to go back to. He'd been thorough. When a man like that decides to end your reputation, he's methodical about it. She smoothed the conditioner into the leather with the correct motion now, feeling the resistance ease. The most honest thing I could tell you is that I hated him for a long time. I still do, some days, but I got tired of carrying it. It's heavy. Hate usually is. She glanced at him. You sound like you're speaking from experience. I'm speaking from watching other people. He worked the post into the clamp on his workbench and began assessing the damage. I haven't had much call for it personally. Not yet. Let's hope it stays that way, she said. It was a careful exchange, two people talking around things rather than directly at them, which was how they still mostly communicated. But it was more than they'd managed in the first week, and she noticed the difference. December arrived with the cold that had teeth, the kind of cold that made the simple act of walking from the house to the barn feel like a negotiation, the kind that crept under doors and formed ice on the inside of the window panes and made you understand, in a very physical way, why people who hadn't come prepared didn't survive the frontier. Evelyn had not come entirely prepared. She'd had 4 days on a train to reconsider that particular truth. But she was adaptable. An adaptation in December meant learning to layer clothing in the right order, keeping the fire through the night, and not complaining about any of it. There were things she hadn't expected to like about the ranch that she found herself liking anyway. The silence, which had seemed oppressive at first, became something she appreciated in a way she couldn't have anticipated. A genuine absence of the constant social noise she'd been managing for years. The way the landscape looked in early morning, when frost made every dry stalk and fence wire catch the low light, and the whole place seemed briefly lit from underneath. The horses, who were not friendly animals in the way dogs are friendly, but who developed a cautious tolerance of her that felt, oddly, like something she'd earned. And Colt himself, though that was a more complicated thing to acknowledge. He was not what she'd expected, not the transaction she'd braced for. And she was still working out what he was instead. A patient man, but not a passive one. Someone who made decisions carefully and stood behind them once made. Someone who didn't use words to fill silence. She had lived a life full of men who used words to fill silence, mostly in service of their own needs, and the absence of that particular pattern was disorienting in a way that was slowly becoming comfortable. She had not let herself think about the marriage part, the actual, eventual marriage, with any real specificity. They had not discussed it directly since her first week. It existed as an understood future condition, waiting in the distance without a fixed date. She was aware that a proper arrangement needed to happen, and that the people of Black Creek were aware of this too, and that the current state of things, a man and woman living under one roof, unmarried, was providing additional material for the kind of talk that was already circulating. But she hadn't raised it and he hadn't raised it, and she'd decided this was because they were both, for different reasons, cautious about making something permanent before they were sure it was sound. She thought she could build something sound with him. She hadn't been sure of that in October when she wrote the letter. She was more sure of it now, in December, which was not the same as being certain, but was enough to get up in the morning and haul water in the cold and do it all again the next day. On a Wednesday evening, about 3 weeks into December, Colt came in from the barn with the kind of expression she had learned to read as something's happened and I'm deciding how to tell you. She set down the account book. Silas Grady, he said, sitting down across from her. She kept her face neutral. What about him? He was at the land office today. Someone from the railroad line was there. Something about easement surveys for a possible route extension. He put his hat on the table and rubbed the back of his neck. Grady has been pushing to consolidate the land east of the station, some smaller parcels. The surveyors being here apparently got him thinking faster than usual. What does that have to do with us? Nothing directly, but while he was there, he mentioned you. By name. Told the railroad man that my wife had arrived under. False pretenses was the phrase used, apparently. That the women in town didn't trust her. That I'd been taken advantage of by someone desperate enough to misrepresent herself in a marriage advertisement. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. The fire ticked. Wind pushed against the window. He said this in front of the land office. In the land office, with the door open. She understood then why he was being careful about how he said it. Not because he believed it, because he knew what she would understand it to mean, that Silas wasn't just spreading gossip. He was using her as a tool for something else, a man who wanted to expand his land holdings and had identified a way to make Colt Bennett look like someone who couldn't be trusted to manage his own affairs. A wife who was rumored to be dishonest was a liability. A liability made a man easier to deal with. He's not just after me, she said. No, Colt agreed, but you're the easiest angle. She looked at the account spread in front of her, all the small, careful numbers she'd been keeping, the order she'd brought to his books. Thought about the ranch, the horses, the fence she'd helped repair, the early mornings and frozen fingers, and the particular way the light came through the east window when she was making coffee before the sun was fully up. What do you want to do? She asked. He met her eyes. I want to know what you want to do. She thought about Philadelphia, about the long, slow defeat of staying in place while someone dismantled the life you'd built around yourself. About the moment she'd decided to leave, not in anger, but in exhaustion, packing a suitcase that wasn't big enough and buying a train ticket to somewhere she'd never been. She was tired of leaving. I want to stay, she said, and I want to fight it. He nodded once, slowly. Then that's what we'll do. He reached across the table and took her hand briefly. Not tenderly, not dramatically, just the quick grip of someone who means what they're saying and wants you to know it, and then let go and reached for the hat on the table. I need to check on the horses, he said. I know, she said. He got up and went out, and she sat with her hands in her lap, and the account spread out in front of her, and the fire warming the room, and thought, this is what it feels like when you stop running. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like ground, solid and cold and real beneath her feet. That was enough, for now. That was more than she'd had in years. The decision to stay and fight was easier to make at a table by a warm fire than it was to live with in the days that followed. Evelyn understood this by the third morning after their conversation, when she walked into the general store for a spool of heavy thread and felt the particular quality of silence that happens when people have been talking about you and stop the moment you appear. Two women near the fabric bolts. The storekeeper's wife, Harriet, behind the counter with an expression that was carefully arranged into something neutral. A man by the door who seemed suddenly very interested in the contents of his coat pocket. She bought the thread and left without hurrying and didn't let her face do anything she'd regret. Outside, the cold hit her, and she stood on the boardwalk for a moment and let it. The main street of Black Creek went about its business around her. A wagon passing, a dog crossing the frozen mud with its nose down, someone hammering at something behind the hardware store. Ordinary sounds of a town that would have been entirely unremarkable if she wasn't standing in the middle of it feeling like a specimen under glass. She walked back to where Colt had left the wagon and climbed up and waited for him without explanation. And when he came out of the feed store 10 minutes later and climbed up beside her and glanced at her expression, he didn't ask what had happened. He just turned the horses toward home. That was the thing about him, she was discovering. He had a sense for when a question would help and when it wouldn't, and he didn't ask questions just to fill the air between them. It was more useful than she would have expected. Harriet Doyle spoke to me, he said, about half a mile out of town. Evelyn looked at him. She didn't say much, he continued. She said, and I'm giving you the accurate version, not the softened one. She said that she wasn't forming an opinion yet, but that people were watching. People are always watching. She meant it more specifically than that. He kept his eyes on the road. She meant that how you carry yourself in the next month or so is going to matter more than whatever Grady says about you. That's how it works here. People make up their minds slow, but they make them up from what they see, not from what they're told. Evelyn processed this. She said that to you, or she said it expecting you to pass it on? She said it to me and looked at me the way a woman looks when she means for you to pass it on. That's actually useful. I thought so. She looked out at the flat, snow-covered ground on either side of the track, the particular emptiness of the winter plains that she had first found oppressive and now found not comforting exactly, but honest. It didn't pretend to be anything. It just was what it was. So the verdict isn't in, she said. Not yet. And Grady? Colt's jaw tightened slightly, which was about as much as his face typically showed. Grady is going to keep doing what he's doing. We can't stop him from talking. What we can do is make the talking matter less. By being visible. By being present, he said. There's a difference. Visible is going to town and making sure people see you. Present is going to town and being useful to people. Being part of things. She thought about Lucy Walsh, who had told her about the blue wool, and then looked at her with that direct, unguarded sympathy. She thought about what it meant to build a reputation in a place instead of inheriting one. I've never had to build from nothing before, she said. It wasn't a complaint, just an observation. Nobody does, more than once. He glanced at her briefly. Most people don't have to. She understood what he meant by that. Most people carried their reputation with them, grew it from the one they'd been born into, patched it when it tore. She was starting with a hole in the middle of hers and a set of rumors she hadn't created. That was the disadvantage. The advantage, and she had been thinking about this carefully because she was someone who looked for the advantage even when it was small, was that nobody here actually knew her. The rumors were secondhand and abstract. What she did from here forward would be the thing people experienced directly, and direct experience, if Harriet Doyle was to be believed, carried weight. She could work with that. She had been working with worse for years. She started with what she knew. The accounts she'd been keeping for Colt's ranch had given her a clear picture of the area's financial rhythms, what was ordered, when, from where, at what prices. It was not a large sample, but it was specific, and she had spent 8 years reading the stories that numbers told if you looked at them long enough. What she noticed, within her first few weeks of reviewing Colt's records and listening carefully to what he said about town business, was that several of the smaller operations in the area were running supply orders inefficiently. Not catastrophically, just the quiet, expensive inefficiency that happened when people ordered without tracking, bought without comparing, and made do without calculating what making do actually cost them. She didn't announce this. She started mentioning it in small ways when it came up naturally. When Lucy Walsh mentioned at the dry goods counter that the seamstress was going through thread faster than expected and didn't know why, Evelyn asked a few questions about the size of orders and what was being produced. A few days later, she came back with a paper showing a simple tracking method she had used in her bookkeeping work, adapted for a small sewing operation. Lucy looked at it, then looked at her. "Did you do this for us?" "I had time," Evelyn said. "It's not complicated." "Can you show me how it works?" She could, and she did, sitting at the small table in the back room of the seamstress's shop for an afternoon while Lucy's employer, a tall, dry-voiced woman named Alma Pratt, observed from across the room with the expression of someone who hadn't asked for help and wasn't sure she wanted it, but could recognize competence when she saw it. "I don't need a bookkeeper," Alma said when Evelyn was done. "I'm not offering to be your bookkeeper," Evelyn said. "It's just the method. You can use it yourself." Alma looked at the paper, looked at her. "Where did you learn that?" "Philadelphia. I kept accounts for a shipping company for 4 years and then for a law firm after that." "You don't look like a bookkeeper." Evelyn didn't know what a bookkeeper was supposed to look like and said so, which startled a short sound out of Alma Pratt that might have been a laugh. She didn't offer any further commentary, but she kept the paper, and the next time Evelyn came into the seamstress to buy buttons, Alma gave her a nod that had nothing performative about it. Just acknowledgement. It was small, it was slow, but it was the kind of small and slow that accumulated. Colt noticed what she was doing without her having to explain it, which she appreciated. He didn't draw attention to it. He also didn't undermine it, which was something she'd been cautious about. The possibility that he might have ideas about where she ought to be and what she ought to be doing that would conflict with the particular strategy she was building. He didn't seem to have those ideas. He had the instinct of someone who had figured out that most things worked better when you let capable people do them and stayed out of their way. What he was doing on his own side was harder for her to track, because he did it in the way men in frontier towns did most things, through presence and proximity, through conversations that happened while doing other things, through the slow accrual of a reputation as someone solid. He had lived in Black Creek for 6 years. He had credit at every business in town. He had done right by his neighbors when they needed it, and hadn't made enemies of people who didn't deserve enemies. That was the ground she was standing on, and she understood it as such. She also understood that it was his ground, not hers, and she needed some of her own. There was, she discovered, a small but regular gathering of women who met on Thursday afternoons at the home of a woman named Frances Halliday, the wife of one of the town's 2 doctors, ostensibly for quilting, but in practice for the exchange of information that formal channels didn't accommodate. It was the kind of gathering that had no official membership and no formal invitation process, but that everyone who attended knew was attended and that it mattered to attend. She found out about it through Lucy, who mentioned it without quite inviting her, in the way of someone who wasn't sure it was hers to invite. Evelyn waited another week before she brought it up with Colt. "Frances Halliday," he said. "Her husband set my broken wrist 2 winters back. She runs the Thursday thing." "Do you know her?" "Not well. She's fair-minded. Doesn't gossip for pleasure, which is more than you can say for some." He looked at Evelyn. "You thinking about going?" "I'm thinking about whether I should." "What's stopping you?" "I haven't been invited." He considered this. "Go anyway." "You can't just—" "You can," he said. "You bring something. Not food, something useful, a skill. And you show up like you were supposed to be there, because the only difference between invited and showing up is usually confidence." She stared at him. "That is the most specific social advice I have ever heard you give." "My mother ran a town in Kansas for 20 years from a sewing circle," he said. "I paid attention." She thought about this for the rest of the week. On the following Thursday, she went. She brought a small book on household accounting methods, her own copy, dog-eared and annotated, that she'd carried from Philadelphia, and she walked into Frances Halliday's parlor at the appropriate hour with it under her arm and the expression of someone who was not at all uncertain about whether she was supposed to be there, even though her heart was going at a rate that she considered frankly unreasonable. There were 7 women in the room. Lucy was there and looked up with something close to relief. Alma Pratt was there and looked up with something closer to assessment. Frances Halliday herself was a composed, sharp-eyed woman of about 50 who rose to greet her with the particular kind of courtesy that could have been warmth or could have been the formal performance of it, and that Evelyn didn't yet have enough information to distinguish. "Mrs. Bennet," Frances said, "we've been expecting you to find us eventually." Evelyn blinked. "Pardon?" "Women with useful skills generally do." She looked at the book under Evelyn's arm. "Is that what I think it is?" "I keep household and business accounts," Evelyn said. "I've spent the past month looking at the supply patterns in this area, and there are some things I think could save people money. If anyone's interested in hearing it." The room was quiet for a moment. Then a heavy-set woman named Ruth Carver, who Evelyn would later learn ran the supply side of her husband's cattle operation, said, "How much money?" And that was how it began. She didn't make friends that afternoon. She didn't expect to. Trust was not built in an afternoon over quilting and accounting manuals, and she was not the kind of woman who confused a good reception with genuine acceptance. But she sat in the room for 2 hours and answered questions and listened carefully and said true things in a plain way. And when she left, Frances Halliday walked her to the door and said, "Same time next Thursday," in the tone of someone making a statement rather than extending an invitation. "Thank you," Evelyn said. "Don't thank me yet," Frances said. "Half of them are still making up their minds." "I know." Frances looked at her with those sharp, measuring eyes. "Silas Grady said some ugly things about you." "I'm aware." "Silas Grady says ugly things about a lot of people when it suits him." The older woman paused. "He said ugly things about my husband once, 10 years back, when Emery refused to certify some land claim of his. The kind of things that follow a man." She stopped there, didn't elaborate, didn't explain what she was and wasn't saying. "Next Thursday," she repeated, and closed the door. Evelyn walked back to the wagon in the cold and sat in the driver's seat for a moment before she took up the reins. It wasn't proof of anything, it wasn't safety, but it was a thread, and she was learning to take threads when they were offered and pull carefully without breaking them. December deepened and the cold with it. There were nights now when the temperature fell to the kind of numbers that made livestock behave strangely and water freeze faster than you expected. The work on the ranch compressed into the urgent, relentless pattern of cold weather survival, keeping the animals in, keeping the pipes from freezing, keeping the wood supply adequate and the fire from going out at night. Evelyn took the fire watch. She'd offered it without being asked, on the logic that she slept lightly anyway, and there was no point in both of them fighting for rest. Colt had argued briefly and then let it go when he recognized she'd already decided, which she was beginning to think was one of the more useful things about him. The late nights were strange. The house at 2 a.m. had a quality she hadn't expected, a specific stillness that was almost companionable, just her and the fire and the sound of the wind working at the walls and the occasional movement from the horses in the barn, audible through the cold air. She would sit in the chair by the hearth and read when the light was good enough, or just think, which was something she hadn't had much space to do in the preceding year. She thought about Black Creek and what she was building in it, piece by piece. She thought about Silas Grady and what he was building against her, and whether it would outpace what she was doing. She thought about the marriage that was still technically pending, the legal arrangement that hadn't yet been formalized, which existed between them like an unfinished sentence neither of them had decided to complete yet. One of those late nights, Colt appeared in the hallway doorway in his work shirt and suspenders, clearly not having slept. "You should be in bed," she said. "Can't sleep." He came and took the other chair, the one farther from the fire, and stretched his legs out. He looked at the fire for a minute. "You think about Philadelphia much?" "Sometimes." She set her book down. "Less than I used to." "Is that good?" "I think so." The thinking wasn't doing anything useful anymore. It was just turning the same things over. He nodded slowly. "What do you think about instead?" She considered being evasive and then didn't see the point. "This," she said. "What's here? What I'm trying to do here." She looked at the fire. "Whether it'll work." "It's working," he said. "You don't know that yet." "I can see it working." He said it plainly, without embellishment. "I've watched how people look at you when you come in now versus how they looked at you the first time. It's different." "Different isn't resolved." "No," he agreed. "But it's different." She looked at him across the dim room, his face lit unevenly by the fire, tired and unhurried and completely without performance. She had been around enough men who performed confidence or authority or concern, to notice the absence of it with a clarity that was almost startling. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes." "Why the advertisement?" She had thought about this question for weeks and hadn't asked it, and she wasn't entirely sure why tonight was different. "You've been here 6 years. You're not a man who struggles to get on with people. Why a letter from a stranger?" He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind had a particular sound it made when it came down from the north without any barrier to break it, a long, hollow note that she had started to find almost musical in the way of something you stop fearing once you understand it. "It's hard to explain without sounding—" He stopped, started again. "There are women here, in town. A couple of them. Their husbands have tried to set up conversations. There's nothing wrong with any of them." He said this carefully, like he was being accurate rather than kind. But in a town this size, everybody knows everybody's history. Everybody has a position on everybody else. It gets heavy after a while. The weight of being already known, she understood that with her whole body. "So you wanted a stranger." "I wanted someone who'd judge me by what I actually did instead of what they'd already decided about me." He turned to look at her directly. "I know that sounds like I was only thinking about myself." "No," she said. "It sounds honest." He looked at her for a moment, and something moved across his face that was hard to name. Not a feeling exactly, or not only that, more like the slow shift of something that had been held at a careful distance, beginning to reconsider where it was standing. "You're not what I expected either," he said. "You said that before." "I keep thinking it." He looked back at the fire. "I keep thinking it because I keep noticing it." She wasn't sure what to do with that, so she picked up her book again, and the two of them sat in the firelit quiet, not talking, while the wind worked at the walls outside. And that was all right. That was, in its way, more than all right. Well, the week before Christmas, Silas Grady escalated. She didn't hear it firsthand. Ruth Carver told her on Thursday. Ruth, who had been thawing incrementally since the second accounting session, and who now had the quality of someone who had made a decision about where she stood and was comfortable with it. "He's been at the land office again," Ruth said, her voice low, the Thursday gathering continuing around them. "My husband heard him talking to a railroad surveyor. He's offering to acquire land in the Eastern Corridor and the Station District both. He said," she paused, "he said he's talking to the railroad because some of the existing landowners in the area can't be trusted to manage their holdings well." That was the phrase. Can't be trusted. Evelyn listened to this with her hands flat on the table and her face controlled. "He named Colt," Ruth continued. "He said a man who brought home a woman of questionable character had to be questioned himself, that his judgment was impaired." He said impaired. That was the word, yes. She was quiet for a moment. Frances Halliday, who'd been listening from across the room and pretending not to, set down her quilting. "What he's doing is a specific thing," Frances said, to the room more generally, but with her eyes on Evelyn. "He wants that land corridor. He's been wanting it for 2 years. The railroad is going to build through there, and whoever holds the land when they do will get paid well for it. Your husband's property falls in that corridor." Evelyn looked at her. "Colt's land is in the easement corridor, part of it. The south parcel, where the creek bends. It's exactly where the surveyors were looking." Frances's voice was dry and precise. "Silas doesn't actually care about you, Mrs. Bennett. He cares about whether he can make Colt look like a liability before the railroad finishes its assessment. A man with a troubled household is a man who can be pressured." The room was very quiet. "So I'm the method," Evelyn said. "You're the easiest method," Frances said. "That's different from being the cause." She sat with this for a moment. Outside the Halliday parlor windows, the winter street was gray and ordinary. People walking, a dog, a wagon, the station master's boy running an errand toward the depot. "How long do we have before the railroad makes its decision?" she asked. Frances exchanged a look with Ruth. "My husband heard the surveyors talking. They're doing the formal assessment in January. The supply arrival before Christmas brings the railroad's regional agent through town. That will be the last informal meeting before the formal process." "The annual supply arrival," Evelyn said. "The weekend before Christmas. The whole town comes out for it. It's the largest gathering of the year." Frances's eyes were careful and specific. "Silas will use it." "Of course he will," Evelyn said. "It's the largest audience he'll have." She thought about the platform at Black Creek Station, about arriving on it 3 months ago with a worn suitcase and tears she couldn't control, feeling the eyes of strangers and the weight of a story already being told about her. She thought about the steam and the cold and Colt appearing out of the crowd and picking up her case and saying, "You don't have to pretend with me." She thought about what it would feel like to stand on that same platform in front of the entire town, whether it would feel like a trap or like a chance. "Thank you," she said to Frances. "Don't do anything rash," Frances said. "That man wants you reactive. He wants you to look exactly like what he's saying you are." "I know," Evelyn said. "I'm not going to be reactive." "What are you going to be?" She considered the question. The fire in the parlor hearth popped once. The quilting resumed around them, needles through fabric, the ordinary work of women who had learned a long time ago how to keep their hands busy while they figured out what to do. "I'm going to be ready," she said. She told Colt that night. She told him all of it. The land corridor, the railroad surveyor, the assessment in January, Silas's specific strategy. She sat across the table from him and laid it out the way she would have laid out a set of accounts. Here's what we have, here's what it means, here's what is likely to happen next. He listened without interrupting, which she'd come to understand meant he was taking it seriously. When she was done, he sat back in his chair and looked at the table for a moment. "The south parcel," he said. "I've had offers on it before. Not from Grady directly, but from people who I suspect were buying for him. I didn't know about the railroad survey. I knew there were rumors, but I thought it was farther east." "It may have shifted," she said. "Frances Halliday's husband has good information." Emery Halliday doesn't speculate. He said it with the tone of someone who had confirmed that observation over years. If he heard something specific, it's specific. So Silas knows his window is closing, Evelyn said. The assessment happens in January. The supply arrival before Christmas is his last real chance to move public opinion before that. And he'll use it to take a shot at you in public. Colt's voice was careful, but there was something underneath it. Not anger exactly, more like the particular focus of a man who has decided on a course of action and is now only concerned with executing it well. At the station platform, most likely. In front of everyone. The whole town, Francis said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at her directly, with an expression she hadn't seen him use before, more open than his usual, something in it that was asking rather than stating. What do you want to do? She had been thinking about this since the Thursday gathering. Not frantically, not anxiously, but with the steady, deliberate consideration she gave to things that mattered. She had thought about what she could control and what she couldn't, what Silas needed and what he didn't have yet, and what the difference was between a woman who had been defined by other people's stories about her and a woman who had decided to speak for herself. I want to be there, she said, and when he does it, whatever he says, I want to answer him myself. Not through you, not through anyone else. Colt looked at her for a long moment. That'll take nerve. I know. He won't be gentle about it. He never has been. People will be watching. People are always watching, she said. Harriet Doyle told you that. The question is what they see. He nodded, slowly. The kind of nod that meant he'd heard it and turned it over and landed somewhere. I'll be there, he said. I'm not going to stand in front of you, but I'll be there. She understood the distinction he was making, and she was grateful for it in a specific, practical way that had nothing to do with sentiment. He wasn't offering to protect her by standing between her and Silas. He was offering to stand beside her, which was the thing she actually needed. Then we go to the supply arrival, she said. We go to the supply arrival. Outside the window, the first real snow of December was beginning. Not the light, apologetic flurries of the past weeks, but actual snow, heavy, purposeful, the kind that intended to stay. She watched it for a moment against the lamplight, the flakes coming down thick and steady. She thought about what it meant to stand on a platform you'd once fled and hold your ground. She thought about the look on Silas Grady's face when he realized he'd miscalculated. She wasn't sure yet what she was going to say, but she had 2 weeks to find the words, and she had never yet found a problem that yielded more to planning than to understanding. Understanding what was true, understanding what other people needed to hear, understanding the difference between a person who apologized for existing and a person who simply stated what was real. She knew what was real. The snow kept falling. Colt got up to check the fire. In the kitchen, she could hear the small sounds of the house settling into the night, the creak of timber, the low complaint of wind finding the gap under the door she kept meaning to seal. She pulled the accounts toward her and picked up her pen. There was still work to do. There was always still work to do, and she had learned in 3 months of frontier life that this was not a burden. It was just the shape of days that meant something. She wrote the next entry in the supply ledger and didn't let herself think too far ahead. The 2 weeks before the supply arrival passed the way difficult waiting always does. Too slowly during the days and too fast in the nights, the hours stretching and compressing in ways that had nothing to do with the clock. Evelyn kept working. It was the only thing that helped. She finished reorganizing Colt's accounts and started a forward projection for the coming spring. What they would need, when they would need it, what prices were likely to do based on the patterns she'd been tracking. She continued going to the Thursday gatherings, where the room had shifted incrementally from cautious tolerance to something closer to routine acceptance. Ruth Carver had started saving questions for her specifically, arriving on Thursdays with a small folded paper of things she'd written down during the week. Alma Pratt had never explicitly said anything warmer than "you're useful," but she had started saving the better fabric remnants when Evelyn came in, setting them aside without being asked. It was not dramatic. None of it was dramatic. It was the slow, unglamorous work of being present and useful and consistent, day after day, which was not the kind of thing anyone wrote stories about, but which was, she was increasingly certain, how lives were actually built. She and Colt had not talked again directly about the supply arrival. They didn't need to. They had said what needed saying, and adding more words to it would have been a way of managing anxiety rather than addressing anything real. Instead, They moved through the days in the particular rhythm they'd established, the household running on a cadence that had stopped feeling provisional and started feeling simply like the way things were. There was one evening, 5 days before Christmas, when she was at the table working, and he came in from checking the animals and stopped in the doorway longer than he usually did, and she looked up and found him watching her with an expression she'd learned was not something he deployed on purpose. It appeared on his face sometimes before he'd remembered to manage it. "What?" she said. "Nothing." He came in and took off his coat. "How's the projection looking?" "Better than I expected if spring prices hold." She turned the paper toward him so he could see. He came and looked over her shoulder, which required him to be close, and neither of them remarked on that. "The south parcel is your main asset," she said. "If the railroad corridor falls where Francis thinks it does." "I know. You should document everything you own on that parcel, every structure, every improvement you've made, dates if you have them." "You think it'll come to that?" "I think it's better to have it and not need it than need it and not have it." She paused. "I also think Silas doesn't have documentation on half of what he's claiming, and he knows it. He's been using rumor and social pressure because they're faster and cheaper than paperwork." Colt was quiet for a moment. "You've been thinking about this a lot." "I think about things I can't control a lot," she said. "It doesn't accomplish anything, but I do it anyway." "That's honest." "I try to be." She pulled the paper back and made a note in the margin. "Go eat something. I left food on the stove." He went, and she heard him in the kitchen moving around. And there was something in that sound, the ordinary domestic sound of a person being present in a house, that she had not realized she had missed until it was back. Not Colt specifically, at first, just the sound of not being alone. Now she suspected it was him specifically. She wasn't going to think too hard about that yet. The morning of the supply arrival was overcast. The sky, the particular uniform gray that in December meant business. She was up before 4, which was unusual even for her, not from planning, but from the simple inability to sleep past it. She lay in the dark for a few minutes, listening to the quiet of the house, and then got up and built the fire and stood in the kitchen drinking coffee in the cold half-light. When Colt appeared at 5:30, she already had breakfast on. He stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at her and then at the stove and didn't say anything about the hour. "Couldn't sleep," she said, before he could ask. "Me neither." He sat down at the table. "After 4? "Just before." He accepted this along with the coffee she set in front of him. They ate without much conversation, which was not unusual, but the quiet this morning had a different texture. Not companionable exactly, more like two people conserving something they were going to need later. Outside, it started snowing around 7. Light at first, the small, precise flakes that preceded serious weather in the way of a warning you could still choose to ignore. "It might get worse," Colt said, looking at the window. "It might," she agreed. "We're going," she said. He looked at her. "I know," he said. "I was going to say we might want to leave earlier before the roads get bad." She felt a small flush of embarrassment that she converted immediately into practicality. "Yes, probably by 9. I'll get the horses ready." Well, they were not the first ones there. The supply arrival was the largest gathering Black Creek had most years. The winter shipment came in on a special freight run that also carried the regional railroad agent, and the combination of practical necessity and the rarity of large company in an isolated winter community meant that people came from as far as 2 hours' ride in every direction. The platform was crowded when they arrived, steam from the locomotive mixing with the cold air and the breath of dozens of people stamping their feet and calling to each other across the noise. Evelyn had been on this platform before, of course. She walked it now differently, knowing the boards, knowing the particular draft that came from the north end where the wind found a gap between the station building and the freight office. She recognized faces. Some of them recognized her with nods or small acknowledgments that meant more than they looked like they meant, because she understood by now the economy of acknowledgement in a place like this. Lucy Walsh was near the south end with Alma Pratt, and Lucy caught her eye and gave her a small, tight smile that communicated a specific kind of solidarity. Alma looked at her with that flat, assessing gaze and then turned back to the train, which Evelyn had come to understand was Alma's version of the same thing. Frances Halliday was with her husband near the station office, and she gave Evelyn one precise nod and then looked meaningfully at something. Not at someone, at the space near the freight crates on the east end of the platform. Evelyn looked. Silas Grady was there. She had seen him in town before, at a distance. A big man in his 50s, heavy-set without being soft, with the look of someone who had built something substantial and spent considerable energy protecting it. He was talking to a man in a good coat who had the particular appearance of someone who had traveled from somewhere larger and was evaluating everything around him with professional interest. The railroad agent. Silas had gotten there first and positioned himself well. She noted this without letting it do anything to her expression. Colt appeared beside her. "I see him." "I know." She kept her voice even. "Let's get the supply order confirmed first. Let it be a normal morning for as long as it is." He glanced at her. "All right." They moved through the platform doing the things they had actually come to do. Confirming their winter supply order with the freight manager, checking that the goods were correctly logged, exchanging the kind of brief, practical conversation with neighboring ranchers that was the actual business of the day. She was aware of Silas the entire time, the way you were aware of weather coming, not looking at it directly, but knowing its location precisely. For about an hour, nothing happened. The freight was unloaded. People collected orders. The station hummed with the ordinary noise of a community resupplying itself for winter. Snow continued falling, heavier now, enough to coat the platform boards and muffle the sound of boots on wood. Then Silas Grady's voice, pitched deliberately to Carrie, "I see Bennett finally brought her out in public." The noise on the platform didn't stop all at once. It dropped in patches, the way conversation dies when something louder and more pointed enters a room. People near the freight office, the cluster of merchants by the supply tables, the two ranch hands who had been arguing about rope. Colt went very still beside her. "Don't," she said quietly, just that. He heard her and he didn't move. She turned. Silas was a few yards away, having moved from the freight crates with the railroad agent still beside him. Whether the man had come willingly or been maneuvered into position, she couldn't tell. Around them, the platform had reorganized itself into the unconscious semicircle that crowds always formed when something was about to happen. "Mr. Grady," she said. "Mrs. Bennett." He said it with the particular emphasis of a man who doubted the title. "Interesting that you're comfortable showing your face at a public gathering after everything." "Everything is a vague word," she said. "Could you be more specific?" She heard someone inhale sharply nearby. That had not been the response he expected. Silas's expression shifted slightly, recalibrating. "I think the people of this town deserve to know the character of the woman Colt Bennett brought here, the circumstances she left behind in Philadelphia." "What circumstances?" she said, still level, still direct. "Dismissal from employment, accusations of conduct." "I know what you've been saying," she said. "I've been hearing it for 2 months." She took one step toward him, not aggressive, just closing the distance to a normal conversational range. "What I'm asking is whether you have anything to support it. Anything at all. A letter, a document, the name of a person I could ask who would confirm what you're claiming." Silas's jaw tightened. "The accusations speak for themselves." "Accusations made by who?" "By people who knew you there." "Which people?" She kept her voice the same, not raised, not heated, simply precise. The same voice she used when she found an error in a column of numbers and asked someone to show her their working. "Give me a name. Give me one name of one person who told you directly what you've been telling this town." The platform was very quiet now. The snow fell without sound. Silas said nothing. "You don't have one," she said, "because you found a piece of gossip that traveled from somewhere and you used it because it was useful to you. Not because you knew it was true. Not because you cared whether it was true." She paused. "I did leave Philadelphia. That part is correct. I left because a man with more power than conscience decided my reputation was easier to destroy than to leave intact. I lost my position and most of what I had, and I came here because this was where I had a chance to start again." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not ashamed of that. I was ashamed of it for a long time, but I'm not anymore. And I noticed that in 2 months of telling people what you think my character is, you haven't once said a single specific thing I've actually done wrong since I arrived here." Silas's face had gone the particular color of a man who had walked into a room expecting one conversation and found himself in a different one entirely. What you've done, he continued, his voice regaining some of its weight, is attach yourself to a man with a valuable property. And say what you mean, Colt said. He had been quiet this whole time, and his voice now was not loud, but it had a quality that made people nearby step back a half inch. Say directly what you're suggesting about my wife and say it with your name behind it. Silas looked at him. Your judgment is obviously. My judgment is my own. Colt's voice was the same, still not raised. And what I'm judging right now is a man who's been trying to acquire land in the station corridor for 2 years and who decided that the fastest way to get what he wants is to make me look like I can't manage my own house. He looked at the railroad agent beside Silas, who had the expression of someone who had been placed in an uncomfortable position and was recalculating rapidly. I don't know what he's told you about my property or my household, but I'd suggest you verify it through channels that don't involve him directly. The railroad agent said nothing, but he took one subtle step sideways that separated him from Silas more clearly than any words would have. Silas looked at the crowd around him, at the faces that were not giving him what he'd expected. Not the slow collective agreement of a community confirming something they'd already decided. Something else. The particular silence of people who were recalibrating. Ruth Carver, from somewhere in the back, said clearly, I've had Mrs. Bennett look at my supply accounts twice. She saved us considerable money. That's a fact with my name on it, since we're talking about facts. Someone else, one of the railroad workers who'd been listening from beside the freight stack, said nothing, but shifted his weight in a way that made his position legible. Silas looked at Evelyn. The muscles in his face were doing something complicated. This isn't over, he said. It came out smaller than he'd intended, and he seemed to know it. No, she agreed. It probably isn't. She said it without heat, without triumph, just a statement. But it's over for today. He held her gaze for a moment longer, the gaze of a man determining whether he'd lost the battle or the war, and finding, in the particular expression on her face, that he couldn't tell. And then he turned and walked toward the station building with the railroad agent trailing after him, the crowd parting without much ceremony to let him through. The platform exhaled. Evelyn became aware that her hands were shaking, not visibly, not dramatically. The shaking was internal. The body's delayed report on what the mind had been managing for the past several minutes. She pressed her fingers together briefly and breathed. Colt was beside her. He didn't say anything. He didn't put his arm around her or make anything of it for the crowd. He just stood there, which was what she'd asked for, and it was enough. Frances Halliday appeared through the dispersing crowd. She looked at Evelyn with those sharp, clear eyes for a moment. Well, she said. Well, Evelyn agreed. You're better at that than I expected. I had a lot of time to think about what I wanted to say. The thinking showed. Frances glanced toward where Silas had gone. He'll regroup. I know. He still has options. The land assessment. I know that too. Evelyn breathed out slowly. One thing at a time. Frances considered her for another moment, in the way she had of measuring things before she committed to a position on them. Then she said, Come to dinner on Wednesday. Emery would like to talk to your husband about the corridor survey. It was not a social invitation. It was something more useful than that. We'll be there, Evelyn said. The afternoon should have been the end of it. The supply arrival began winding down around 2 o'clock. The freight mostly distributed, the crowd thinning as people loaded wagons and turned toward home before the roads got worse. The snow that had been falling steadily all morning had deepened from inconvenient to serious, and the sky to the northwest had the color of a system that intended to get worse before it got better. Evelyn and Colt were at the wagon when one of the railroad workers came at a near run across the platform, his face tight with something more urgent than weather concern. Mr. Bennett, there's been an incident on the north siding. Colt turned immediately. What kind? Freight car derailed, coming off the siding onto the main line. It went over. There's cargo everywhere, and there are 2 men pinned under debris. The worker's breath was coming fast. And the cargo's the winter coal shipment for the eastern residential route. The cold calculation of what that meant moved through Evelyn before she'd consciously processed it. Coal for the eastern residential route meant coal for a dozen families, some of them with small children, in the coldest part of a Dakota winter. How far is the siding? She asked. 1/4 mile north. up past the water tower. She looked at Colt. He was already looking at her. "The men first," he said. "The coal second," she agreed. "If it gets buried under this snow, we won't find half of it until spring." They left the wagon where it was. Colt pulled two other men from the thinning crowd, a large rancher named Ed Carver, Ruth's husband, and a railroad maintenance worker who happened to be near the platform edge. And Evelyn went back into the station building and found the station master's office. The station master was a harried man named Brody, who managed stress by becoming very still and precise, which she respected. "The north siding," she said. "How many men do you have available right now?" He told her. She did the arithmetic quickly. "You need to get word to the freight office that we're going to need the draft horses from the supply wagon. At least 2 teams for moving debris. And someone needs to go through the crowd before everyone leaves and ask who can stay and help load. It needs to happen in the next 10 minutes or the manpower is gone." Brody looked at her. "Who are you?" "I'm Mrs. Bennett." She paused half a second. "I keep accounts and I understand logistics. You need someone to coordinate the civilian side of this while you manage the railroad side. I can do that." Another half second. "Or I can stand here while you decide, but those men are still pinned." He made the decision in about 3 seconds, which she gave him credit for. "Do it," he said. The next 2 hours were the kind of experience that rearranged how you understood yourself. She had organized supply orders. She had managed household accounts. She had sat in parlors and calibrated the precise weight of every word she said. None of that was the same as standing in the middle of a snowstorm on a railroad siding at 4 in the afternoon, directing draft horses and volunteer labor, and a growing number of people who needed to be told in real time what to do with a derailed freight car, and 200 tons of scattered coal, and 2 injured men under a section of collapsed freight housing. The men were reached first. Ed Carver and the maintenance worker and Colt got the first section of debris moved within 20 minutes. Brutal, physical work in the wind and snow, the kind that left marks on hands and bent backs wrong. One man was bruised and shaken and walked out with help. The second had a leg badly pinned and had to be moved more carefully, which required Evelyn to run back to the station for the doctor's kit from the first aid cabinet and bring it out while Dr. Halliday was being located. She ran. On a snowy rail bed in her good winter boots. She did not think about her boots. When she got back, Emery Halliday had materialized from somewhere. Francis, she would later learn, had sent someone for him the moment word spread. And he worked on the pinned man with the concentrated calm of a doctor in the field, while Colt and Ed Carver held the section of car frame that was still pressing. She turned to the coal. "If we move it by hand and stack it, we'll lose half to the drifts and the rest will be impossible to shift by morning," she told Brody, who was at her shoulder. "We need the supply wagon flatbeds, 3 of them, if you have them. Drive them to the perimeter and we form lines." "We don't have enough men." "We have enough, if we use them right." She looked out at the crowd of people that had gathered at the siding edge. Volunteers, curious bystanders, people who had not yet left with their wagons. "Line them up. Short distance carry, 10 feet maximum, pass it down. It's slower, but every person can do it." "You done this before?" "I organized a shipping warehouse for 4 years," she said. "Different cargo, same principle." They formed the lines. It was not efficient. People dropped coal, misheard instructions, stood in each other's way. 2 men got into a brief, heated argument about the correct stacking method that she ended by simply walking up to them, taking the piece of coal from the one who was wrong, and demonstrating the alternative without comment. The wind was brutal by now, coming down from the northwest in sustained gusts that made your eyes water and your ears ache. The snow came horizontal in the worst of it. She moved through it, calling directions, redirecting people who were doubling up in the wrong places, tracking the flatbed's capacity against what was left on the ground. Her hands stopped feeling like her hands after the first 30 minutes. They became functional tools that she was operating from a distance. She didn't think about being cold. There was no room for it. At some point, she was aware of Colt appearing beside her. "Second man's out," he said. "Emery's got him." "Good." She gestured toward the far end of the siding. "The corner stack is falling behind. Can you take that end?" "Yes." He looked at her for a moment, the look she was getting used to, the one that appeared before he'd had time to manage it. "You all right?" "Yes. Go." He went. The daylight was entirely gone by the time they finished. What light remained came from the station lanterns someone had extended out on poles, and from the lamps on the freight wagons. In that yellow, unsteady light, The siding looked like the aftermath of something, which it was. The flatbeds were loaded. The coal was stacked and covered with the tarpaulins that Brody had found in the freight office. The scattered debris of the freight car had been moved to the siding perimeter. Evelyn stood in the middle of it and looked at what they'd done and felt. Not triumph, not pride exactly. Something quieter and more particular. The satisfaction of a job that needed doing and got done. Nothing more and nothing less. Her hands were shaking again. This time they were shaking on the outside too. "Here!" Lucy Walsh appeared from somewhere and put a blanket around her shoulders. She was shaking herself, her nose red, her neat Thursday hair a wreck from the wind. "I stayed," she said, slightly unnecessarily. "I told Alma I was staying, and she—" Lucy paused. "She stayed too, actually. She said she wasn't going to be the only one in the shop who didn't." Evelyn looked over and found Alma Pratt on the far end of the platform, accepting a cup of hot coffee from the station master's boy with the expression of someone who had done something slightly against their own expectations and was not displeased about it. "Come get warm," Lucy said. "In a minute." She needed another minute in the cold first, alone with the dark and the snow and the specific particular fact of what this night had been. She breathed it in. Cold air, coal dust, the iron smell of the tracks, the sounds of the crowd reassembling into the ordinary, the injured men being moved to Halliday's office, the horses being led back to their posts. And then Colt was beside her. He had the look of 2 hours of hard labor in the cold, coat torn at the shoulder seam, hands blackened with coal and probably blood from the debris work, a cut above his right eyebrow that he didn't seem to have noticed. "You're bleeding," she said. "I know." He didn't move to address it. He stood beside her and looked out at the siding, at the covered flatbeds and the lantern light, and the last few people moving across the platform. "Evelyn." She waited. "What you did today," he said. "Both things." He stopped. "I don't know how to say this right." "You don't have to say it." "I want to." He turned to look at her directly, and his expression was the most unguarded she had seen it. Not the before he'd managed it look, but the look of a man who had decided to stop managing it. "What you did out there with Grady, that took— I've seen men who couldn't have done that. And then to turn around and do this." He gestured at the siding. "I want you to know that I see it, all of it." She looked at him for a long moment. Her hands were still shaking and she was too cold to properly feel her feet, and her good boots were probably destroyed and she was standing on a dark railroad siding in a snowstorm. "I know you see it," she said. He nodded. He reached up and took her hand, both of hers because they were shaking, and held them for a moment in his, which were warm despite everything, or warm enough. He didn't say anything else. She didn't need him to. Around them, Black Creek went on being itself, the noise and the cold, and the ordinary mess of a frontier community pulling itself together after a hard night. In the station building, someone had found a stove going and people were crowding in for warmth. Voices, laughter, the particular relief of people who had done something difficult and were now on the other side of it. She would have to go in. There would be people to speak with, thanks to receive, the station master to check in with. The night was not quite over, but for another moment she stood still in the cold with her hands held in his, on the platform where she had once arrived broken and been put back together by a stranger who said, "You don't have to pretend with me." And she let herself have the moment before the moment passed. The snow kept falling. It was not, she thought, the ending she had imagined for this day. It was better. The cut above Colt's eyebrow required 4 stitches. Evelyn discovered this when they finally got inside the station building and into the light, and she saw the full extent of it, a clean gash from a piece of freight housing timber, still seeping despite the cold that should have slowed it. She found Emery Halliday finishing with the second injured railroad man and waited until he was done before she touched Colt's arm and nodded toward the doctor without saying anything. Colt looked at her. "It's fine. It needs stitches. It'll close on its own." Colt. She said his name in a particular way, not sharp, not impatient, but with the specific weight of someone who was not going to have this argument and expected him to understand that. "Sit down and let the doctor look at it." He sat down. Emery Halliday cleaned and stitched the cut with the economy of a man who had done this hundreds of times, while Colt sat on the edge of a supply crate and endured it with the expression of someone who found the fuss unreasonable but had made a calculation about which arguments were worth having. Evelyn stood to one side and watched, and thought about the fact that 4 hours ago she had been standing on this platform trying to remember how to breathe, and now she was watching her husband get stitched up under a station lantern, while around them the community of Black Creek drank coffee and talked too loud with the particular relief of people who had been through something together. "You'll want to keep it clean," Emery said, tying off the last stitch. "Change the dressing every other day." He looked at Evelyn. "You know how to do that?" "Yes." "Good." He put his kit away and looked at Colt with the mild satisfaction of a craftsman reviewing his work. "Your wife organized the coal recovery." "I know," Colt said. "Brody told me. Said he didn't know what he would have done without someone who could think in straight lines under that kind of pressure." Emery glanced at Evelyn again. The same measuring look his wife used, though warmer at the edges. "Francis said you were capable." "Francis is usually right, which is convenient for both of us." Evelyn thought about what a long way that was from the woman who had stood on this platform in November with a suitcase and no idea what came next. She didn't say so out loud. Some things you kept for yourself. They stayed another hour because leaving immediately would have had the quality of flight, and she was done with flight. People came to her in ones and twos, not ceremonially, not with the exaggerated warmth that would have meant they were performing something, but with the ordinary brevity of people who had a thing to say and said it and moved on. The rancher Ed Carver shook her hand and told her she had a good head for organization, which from him was clearly high praise delivered at a significant discount. A railroad worker whose name she hadn't caught told her the coal stacking method had saved them at least an hour. The station master Brody found her by the coffee urn and said simply, "Thank you, Mrs. Bennett," and then turned red and went back to his office. She accepted all of it with the same even, direct manner she'd been working to maintain for months, not deflecting, not performing humility, not swelling with it either, just receiving it as what it was, people being accurate about what had happened. Lucy Walsh found her near the door as people were beginning to leave. "You're all right?" Lucy asked. She had the look of someone who had been watching her for the past hour and was reporting on what she'd seen. "I'm tired," Evelyn said, "and I think I ruined my boots." Lucy looked down at the boots in question, which were indeed no longer salvageable. "Come to the shop on Monday. Alma has a pair that came in on the freight that might fit you. She won't say it outright, but she told me to tell you." "She told you to tell me." "She said, and I'm giving you the exact words, tell her to come by Monday if she needs boots." Which, from Alma, is practically, well, it's a lot. Evelyn almost smiled. "Tell her I'll be there." The drive home was very quiet in the way that comes after a day that has used all of you up. The snow had eased to something lighter, the worst of it apparently having moved through while they were inside, and the road was passable though slow. The horses moved steadily in the dark, finding their way more by instinct than by sight, and Evelyn sat beside Colt with the blanket still around her shoulders and watched the dark plane moving past. She thought about Silas Grady. He had not reappeared after the confrontation on the platform. Whether he had left early or simply made himself scarce, she didn't know. She had not looked for him during the recovery work, having more immediate things to attend to, and he had not looked for her, which she was willing to interpret as either strategic retreat or the beginning of something else. "He'll find another angle," she said when they were about halfway home. Colt, who had also apparently been thinking about it, didn't seem surprised by the conversation starting without preamble. "Probably. The land assessment is in January. That's 3 weeks. I know. Whatever he does next, it'll be before the assessment. He's out of time after that." Colt shifted the reins. The horse's breath made white clouds in the dark. "Emery Halliday wants to meet before Christmas. He has information about the corridor survey that he didn't want to say in the station." Francis mentioned the dinner, Wednesday. "He may have documentation of his own. Emery's been in Black Creek longer than almost anyone. He was here when the original land grants were filed." She absorbed this. It was a thread she hadn't had before. "Do you know what he found?" "No. But he asked specifically about the south parcel, about when I acquired it and what improvements I've made." She thought about the documentation she'd been building for the past 2 weeks. The careful, dated record of every structure, every repair, every fenced acre on the south parcel. She'd done it on instinct and on the basic professional habit of covering things she couldn't afford to lose. "I have it," she said. "The documentation. I've been keeping it." She felt him look at her in the dark, though she was watching the road. "Since when?" "Since I figured out what Silas was actually after. 2 weeks ago, approximately." She paused. "I should have told you I was doing it." "Why didn't you?" She thought about the honest answer. "Because I wasn't sure it was the right instinct yet. I didn't want to worry you over something that might not matter." He was quiet for a moment. I understand that, but—" "I know," she said. "We're doing this together. I should have said." Another pause, longer this time. The kind of pause that she had learned meant he was considering something carefully rather than having nothing to say. "I do the same thing," he said finally. She looked at him. "Decide it's not ready to be a conversation yet," he said. "Work it out on my own first. Wait until I'm sure." He glanced at her briefly. "It's probably a habit we should both work on." "Probably," she agreed. It wasn't a fight. It wasn't even close to a fight, but it had the quality of something true being said plainly, and she had learned in the years before this one how rare that was and what it was worth. The days between the supply arrival and the Wednesday dinner were strange in a way she hadn't anticipated. Not with tension exactly, but with the particular feeling of waiting for a door to open that you'd already knocked on. The town had shifted around her in some way she couldn't fully articulate, the shift being not dramatic enough to point at directly, but unmistakable in aggregate. Harriet Doyle at the general store was warmer, not performatively, but in small, practical ways. She directed Evelyn to the better flour without being asked. She mentioned the supply of candles before Evelyn had to inquire. The hardware man who had told Colt about the circulating rumors in October stopped her outside his shop one morning to mention that he'd heard good things about what she'd done at the station. She thanked him without making more of it than it was, which was a small thing, but she was learning that small things added up. The Thursday gathering after the supply arrival had a different quality, not larger. The same women, the same parlor, the same quilting that was honestly secondary to everything else, but different in the specific way of people who had watched something happen and were now adjusting their positions accordingly. Frances Halliday opened the afternoon not with the usual circuit of practical business, but with a direct acknowledgement. "What happened at the station this week matters. I think everyone here knows that." No one disagreed. What surprised Evelyn was what happened after that. Not more discussion of the station, not more praise or analysis of the events, but a simple collective turn toward the next thing. Ruth Carver had questions about the spring supply contracts. Alma Pratt mentioned a problem with the seamstress's lease renewal. Someone else raised an issue about the school supply budget. Business, ordinary, and specific, of the kind that assumed her presence as a given. She sat in the room and answered questions and listened and contributed where she could, and somewhere in the middle of it she understood what had shifted. She was no longer a subject of consideration. She was a participant. It was, in its quiet way, the thing she had been working toward since November. The dinner at the Halliday house on Wednesday was in the parlor Frances used for the Thursday gatherings, but smaller and more deliberate. Just the four of them, the table set with the careful efficiency of a household that ran on precision, the food plain and good. Emery Halliday, in his own space, was different from the doctor Evelyn had watched work on an injured man on a railroad siding. He was still precise, still economical, but he had the relaxed manner of a man among people he'd decided to trust. And he got to the point without much preliminary. "I want to show you something," he said after the first course, and he went to the sideboard and came back with a folded document that he set on the table between them. "I've had this for about 8 years. It came to me when a man named Horace Kettler sold his land and left the territory. He asked me to hold certain documents, which I did, and then he died in Kansas 2 years later, and they stayed with me." Colt looked at the document without touching it. "What is it?" "It's a survey map," Emery said. "Original territory survey, 1869, before the railroad was even seriously proposed." He unfolded it carefully. It was old, the paper worn at the creases, the ink faded but legible. The land in the eastern corridor, including the station district, the parcels as they were originally delineated. Evelyn looked at the map. She had a good eye for figures and spatial relationships from years of working with columns and layouts. and she followed the survey lines with the same attention she gave to account entries. She found what she was looking for about 30 seconds before Colt did. "That parcel," she said, pointing without touching, "east of the station, with the creek boundary. That's filed as common land." "It is," Emery said. Colt looked at him. "That's Grady's main acquisition. He's had that land for 3 years." "He's been using it for 3 years," Emery said. "Whether he has proper claim to it is a different question." He folded his hands on the table. "Kettler originally filed on that parcel. He let his claim lapse in '71 before he sold and left. When a claim lapses, it reverts. In this territory, reverted land goes back to common status unless specifically refiled through the land office with a clean title." "Did Grady refile?" Evelyn asked. "I've been to the land office twice in the past week," Emery said. "The filing he made in '72 references the original Kettler claim. It doesn't account for the lapse, which means his title has an irregularity that a sufficiently motivated inquiry would expose." The table was very quiet for a moment. The fire in the Halliday hearth made its small sounds. Francis, who had clearly known all of this already and had been watching the conversation with the patient attention of someone watching a chess game they'd already analyzed, refilled the water glasses without commentary. "He knows," Colt said. It wasn't a question. "He's known for years, I suspect," Emery said. "It's why he's been aggressive about acquiring surrounding land. The more land he holds with clean title, the less one irregular filing matters. But if the railroad easement goes through that specific parcel, the title will be scrutinized by lawyers who know what to look for." "Which is why he needs our land," Evelyn said, following the thread now with the clarity that came when numbers and patterns resolved into a shape. "If he holds your south parcel legitimately, it expands his footprint enough that the irregular parcel becomes secondary to the overall acquisition. He can bury it." "That's my understanding," Emery said. "And the railroad agent," Colt said. "I've written to a colleague in the regional office," Emery said, "not making accusations, simply flagging a survey inconsistency that might be relevant to the easement assessment, as a courtesy, from one professional to another." He said the last part with a dryness that meant he understood exactly what he was doing and had no illusions about its purity. "I thought it was the kind of thing the assessment team would want to know before they filed their recommendation." Colt looked at him for a long moment. "Emery, why are you doing this?" The doctor considered the question in the way of someone who had thought about it before and was willing to say the honest thing. "Because Silas Grady said that my husband's professional judgment was compromised by personal interests," Francis said, from beside the water pitcher. She said it with perfect composure, the composure of someone who had been waiting to say something true for 8 years and was in no hurry now that the moment had arrived. "Francis," Emery said, with the mild tone of a man who had lived with this woman for 30 years and stopped being surprised by her around the 15th. "He said it in '69, she said to Colt and Evelyn. "Emery refused to certify a land claim. Grady said my husband was compromised. He said it where it would be heard, and it followed Emery for years." She set the pitcher down. "I don't forgive things like that. I wait." The room was very quiet. "Thank you," Evelyn said to both of them, meaning it in a way that went past the word. "Don't thank us," Francis said, sitting back down. "Help us with the dessert. It's too much for 2 people." Silas Grady appeared at the ranch on Friday morning. Evelyn was in the barn when she heard the horse on the approach track, and she came out to find a rider she didn't immediately recognize pulling up near the house. And then she recognized the horse, which she'd seen tied outside the land office, and then she recognized the man in the saddle, who was alone and without the self-assured bearing of his platform performance. He looked like someone who had made a decision and wasn't entirely comfortable with it. Colt came out from the house. The 2 men looked at each other from horse height and ground level for a moment. "Bennett," Silas said. "Grady." Colt's voice was neutral, not warm, not hostile. The voice of a man who was waiting to see what this was before he decided what it was. Silas dismounted. He did it with the slight stiffness of a man in his 50s who had been riding in cold weather, and he stood beside his horse and didn't come closer. "I'm not here to," he started, and then seemed to find the sentence harder to finish than he'd expected. "I heard from the land office about the survey inquiry." "Did you?" "I know where it came from." His eyes moved briefly to Evelyn, who had come to stand near the barn door, and then back to Colt. "I want to be clear about something." "Go ahead," Colt said. What I did with your wife's reputation. He said it without preamble, without dressing it up. I was looking at the bigger picture and I used what was available. He stopped. I'm not asking you to think well of me for it. I know what it was. The cold air was very still. In the distance, a hawk was circling. Evelyn waited. She wanted to hear what Colt would say before she said anything herself. What do you want, Silas? Colt said. I want to know if this goes further. He meant the survey inquiry. Whether they intended to push it to a full investigation, which would expose the title irregularity and potentially cost him the eastern parcel entirely. Colt looked at him for a long moment. That depends, Colt said, on whether you're done. Silas looked at him. Not on me, Colt said. On whether you leave my household alone, whether the talk stops, whether what you've spent 2 months doing to my wife's reputation in this town gets corrected in every conversation you've had it in. He said this without raising his voice, which made it more definitive than shouting would have been. You started something. You can end it or it can end without your participation. Either way, it ends. Silas stood with his hand on his horse's bridle in the cold, and Evelyn could see him working through it. The calculation of a man who had built something over many years and was assessing what it would cost to protect it. Not a comfortable calculation, not the kind that left you feeling good about yourself. I didn't know it was entirely unfounded, he said finally, what I heard about her past. Didn't know or didn't check, Evelyn said from the barn door. He looked at her directly for the first time since arriving. Didn't check, he said after a moment. It cost him something. That's accurate. It was a convenience, she said. You found something that could be useful, and you used it without verifying it because verifying it might have made it less useful. He didn't deny it. What I want, she said, is what Colt said. That it stops. And that when you're in a room where it's been said, you correct it with your own name on the correction. She looked at him steadily. You have enough authority in this town that your correction carries weight. That's what I want. The silence stretched. The hawk had descended somewhere to the south, out of sight now. All right, Silas said. All right, which part? Colt asked. All of it. He said it flatly, with the resignation of a man closing a ledger on a bad quarter. I'll correct it. No one offered him coffee. No one suggested they shake hands. He remounted, turned his horse toward the road, and left the way he'd come without looking back. Evelyn stood in the cold and watched him go until he disappeared around the curve in the track. Then she breathed out slowly through her nose. Do you believe him? She asked. Colt was quiet for a moment. I believe he's smart enough to know the alternative is worse, he said. Whether he actually means it or just means the calculation. That's a different question. Does it matter? Practically? No. He turned toward her. The result's the same. She nodded. It wasn't satisfaction exactly. Not the clean, complete kind. It was the messier, more accurate version of a resolution that had involved a man deciding to do right for the wrong reasons. She'd take it. I'm going back to the accounts, she said. I'll start on the fence repair. They went back to what needed doing, which was not an anticlimax. It was just the shape of ordinary days, and she had come to understand that ordinary days were what everything else was in service of. Hush. Christmas came and went without ceremony, which was how they both seemed to prefer it. She made a better meal than usual. He fixed the gap under the front door that she'd been meaning to seal since November. They spent the evening at the table with the fire high and a rare bottle of something decent that he'd gotten from the hardware man's end-of-year supply, and they talked, really talked, in a way they hadn't quite managed before, the conversation ranging across things that had nothing to do with the ranch or Silas or the railroad corridor. His family in Kansas, which he didn't discuss often, her years as a young woman in the city before the work became serious, the specific texture of loneliness in a place where you're surrounded by people versus the loneliness of a frontier winter. I thought it would be the isolation that got to me, she said, when I first came out here. The quiet. And it wasn't? I liked the quiet. What I didn't expect was how much I cared about. She gestured vaguely at nothing specific. About this. About it working. I think I came out here expecting not to care what happened, and then I did. He turned his glass in his hand. When did you notice? She thought about it honestly. Around the time Silas started. When I realized I was angry rather than resigned. Angry meant I had something to lose. She looked at the fire. I hadn't had something to lose in a long time. He was quiet for a moment, then, I'm glad you answered the letter. So am I, she said. Now. You weren't before? I was terrified before. She said it without embarrassment. On the train, I second-guessed it every hour. I thought I'd made a desperate mistake. I thought you'd see through me immediately and put me back on the train. See through what? I don't know. All of it. The fear under the practicality. She paused. I put a lot of work into seeming like I had things under control. I knew you were frightened, he said. I know you did. She looked at him. You just didn't use it against me. He looked back at her with the expression she still hadn't entirely learned to read, the one that appeared when he'd stopped managing his face. I wouldn't do that. I know that now, she said. I didn't know it then. The fire made its small sounds. Outside the window, the winter dark was complete and very still, the post-Christmas night with its particular quality of the world having gone quiet. We should do the ceremony, he said. Make it proper. She had been expecting this conversation and had thought about it carefully from several angles. Yes, she said. When the snow eases. New Year. Early January, if the roads allow. At the station, he said. She looked at him. Frances said she'd arrange it, he said, with the slight look of a man who had already had a conversation with Frances Halliday and knew exactly what he was walking into. Small, just the people who should be there. She thought about the station, about November and the platform, and what it had been then versus what it was now. About the idea of beginning something formal in the place where everything had actually begun. Yes, she said. That's right. He nodded, satisfied in the particular way of someone who had thought a thing through and arrived at the correct answer. He refilled her glass without asking, and then his own. She watched him. This man who had picked up a stranger's suitcase and said, "You don't have to pretend with me," and had, it turned out, meant it in ways she hadn't yet fully understood when he said it. She was still learning the full extent of what he meant. She thought she probably would be for a long time. That seemed, all things considered, like a reasonable way to spend the years ahead. The railroad assessment came back in mid-January with findings that confirmed the corridor ran through the south parcel and several surrounding properties. The assessment also flagged a title irregularity in an adjacent eastern holding that would require resolution before any easement agreements could be finalized. Silas Grady spent 3 weeks in correspondence with the Territorial Land Office before quietly settling the matter. His claim was restructured, his eastern acreage reduced, and his leverage over the corridor diminished substantially enough that his negotiating position with the railroad was considerably weaker than it had been in December. He did not come back to the ranch. He did, by several accounts that reached Evelyn over the following weeks. Through Ruth Carver, through Lucy Walsh, once directly through Harriet Doyle at the general store, who said it with the satisfaction of someone reporting a fact they'd been hoping to report. He did correct himself. In the conversations where he'd spoken about her, he found ways to unspeak it. Not dramatically, not with apology, simply by saying, when it came up, that he'd heard things he couldn't verify and shouldn't have passed on. It was not much, but it was, as Colt had said, the same result regardless of the reason behind it. And the town of Black Creek, which had been watching and assessing and making up its slow, careful, collective mind, had by now mostly made it up. Not in Evelyn's favor, exactly. It wasn't the kind of thing that worked that cleanly. More that she had stopped being something to be decided about and had become simply someone who lived there, who kept good accounts and showed up on Thursdays and had organized a coal recovery in a snowstorm, and who, as of a cold Saturday morning in early January, had married Colt Bennett in a small ceremony at the train station, with Frances and Emery Halliday as witnesses, Lucy Walsh crying quietly in the second row of the small crowd that had simply shown up because word gets around in a town that size. Evelyn had worn her best dress, which was the same one she'd worn arriving. She noticed that about herself and felt it was appropriate. The station master Brody had shaken her hand afterward and said she was welcome on his platform anytime, which was not the most romantic thing anyone had ever said to her, but which meant more than most of the romantic things had. She stood on the platform in the cold January light and looked out at the tracks disappearing into the distance, east toward the world she'd come from, and felt nothing in particular about them anymore. No pull, no fear. just tracks, just distance, just the familiar landscape of a life she had left and did not need to return to. Behind her, Colt was talking to Ed Carver about the spring fence repair schedule, which was very like him. And Francis was giving Lucy a look that communicated several things simultaneously, and the station master had found an excuse to go back to his office now that the handshaking was done. Evelyn turned away from the tracks. She had somewhere to be. The spring came late that year, the way it sometimes did on the plains, not gradually, not with the slow thaw that eased a person into the new season, but all at once, the cold releasing its grip over the course of about 4 days in late March, and leaving behind a landscape that was suddenly, almost violently, alive again. The frozen ground turned to mud, then dried, then greened. The creek on the south parcel ran high and fast with meltwater. The horses, who had spent 4 months in the barn with the philosophical resignation of animals that understood they had no other options, moved through the paddock with an energy that was almost embarrassing. Evelyn noticed all of it. She had started noticing the ranch in a way that was different from the cataloging attention of her first months. Not assessing it, not calculating what it needed, but simply seeing it. The way the morning light came across the south field. The particular sound the wind made through the gap in the paddock fence that Colt still hadn't fully repaired, which she had stopped mentioning because she had come to recognize it as a sound that belonged to this place. She was in the kitchen one morning in early April, working through a correspondence that had accumulated over the winter. She had started keeping accounts for 3 other operations in the area by then, a natural extension of what had begun with Alma Pratt's thread problem and Ruth Carver's supply questions. When she heard the horse on the approach track, she looked up, not with alarm. She had stopped responding to sounds with alarm sometime in February, which she counted as a form of progress. It was Lucy Walsh, which was unusual. Lucy came on Thursdays and occasionally on errands, but not on a Tuesday morning unannounced. She was off her horse before it had fully stopped and coming toward the door with an expression that was trying to contain something. Evelyn opened the door before she knocked. "He's leaving," Lucy said. Evelyn looked at her. "Who?" "Silas Grady." Lucy was slightly out of breath, less from the ride than from the news. "He's selling. The land office has a notice. He's listed 4 parcels, including the eastern holding, and he's booked passage east on the April freight run." Evelyn stood in the doorway and considered this. She had not expected it, and she examined that fact for a moment, the texture of her own surprise, because she had become interested, over these months, in being accurate about her own reactions rather than performing the ones that seemed appropriate. She wasn't satisfied exactly. She wasn't triumphant. There was something more complicated than either of those. Something that had to do with the difference between wanting a person to lose and watching them leave, and how much smaller the second thing felt than you thought it would. "When?" she said. "The freight run is Thursday." "This Thursday?" "Yes." Evelyn stepped back and let her in. "Come in. I'll make coffee." She told Colt that evening. He had been out most of the day working the south parcel. The railroad had finalized their easement agreement in February, a modest payment for access through the creek bend, which was not a fortune but was enough to cover the spring supply orders and the fence repairs and leave something toward the north pasture expansion he'd been planning for 2 years. He came in with the look of a man who had done a full day's physical work and found it satisfying, and she waited until he'd cleaned up and sat down before she told him. He received the information the way he received most things, in silence, turning it over. "He's really going," he said finally. Not a question. More like saying it out loud to hear what it sounded like. "The notice is filed. Lucy saw it." He stretched his shoulders against some ache from the day's work and looked at the table. "I thought he'd stay, restructure and stay. He's built a lot here." "He built it on something that wasn't solid," she said. "I think he knew that for a long time, and it got heavier as time passed. When the assessment went the way it went, maybe the weight became more than the thing was worth." Colt looked at her. "That's almost generous." "I'm not trying to be generous," she said. "I'm trying to be accurate. There's a difference." She paused. "He did a real thing to me. He used my past like a tool, and he spread it through a town where I was trying to start over. And it cost me months of... I'm not forgiving that. I'm just not letting it be the last thing I think about him either. He was a man who made a calculation, and it didn't work out, and now he's leaving. That's all it is." Colt considered this for a moment. You've changed how you talk about things since you got here. She looked at him. How do you mean? In November, he said, carefully, the way he said things when he wanted to be precise rather than diplomatic. You talked about the banker in Philadelphia the same way, like you'd made a decision about what he was and sealed it up. This sounds different. She thought about that. He was right. She'd noticed it herself, the way certain old angers had become less interesting to maintain than they used to be. Whether that was wisdom or exhaustion or something that happened when you were too busy building to spend energy on tearing down, she wasn't entirely sure. I think, she said slowly, that I used to hold on to things because I was afraid that if I let go of them, I'd lose the evidence, the record of what had happened and who was responsible. She turned her coffee cup in her hands. And then I realized I didn't need evidence anymore. I know what happened. I was there. The record doesn't need to be held in anger for it to be true. Colt was quiet for a long moment. Your mother ran a town from a sewing circle, she said. Mine kept every letter that was ever written about her, good or bad, in a box under her bed. She read them sometimes. I thought it was strange when I was young. I understand it better now. Do you still do it? No, she said. I burned them before I left Philadelphia, the copies I had of what was written about me. She paused. I thought it would feel like losing something. It felt like putting down weight I'd stopped noticing I was carrying. He nodded, slowly, in the way that meant he'd heard it, and it meant something to him that he wasn't going to articulate further, which was fine. Some things didn't need more words than they'd already been given. Odd. She went to the station on Thursday. Not because she had cargo coming in, not because she had arranged to. She went because it was the day Silas Grady's freight passage was booked, and because she had made a choice months ago about what the station meant to her, and she intended to be deliberate about it. Colt knew she was going and didn't ask to come, which meant he understood what she was doing, which was one of the things about him she had stopped taking for granted and started being actively grateful for. The morning was clear and cold the way April mornings still were. Brilliant light, sharp air, the particular quality of a day that intended to be warm later but hadn't gotten there yet. She drove herself, which she'd been doing routinely since February, the horses responsive and familiar under her hands in a way that still occasionally surprised her with its plainness. The platform was not empty. It never was when the freight run was due, but it was quieter than December. A few merchants. The station master Brody moving between the office and the platform edge. A family she didn't recognize, probably boarding. Silas Grady was near the far end of the platform with 2 trunks and a young man she didn't know who was probably hired to manage the luggage. He looked different from the man who had stood in the center of the crowd in December and made his accusations with the confidence of someone who believed his position was secure. He looked like a man who was carrying his remaining dignity carefully, the way you carry something fragile. She didn't go to him. She stood near the south end of the platform, her end, she had begun to think of it, the end where she'd first stepped off the train in November, and watched the activity of the station around her. The freight manager and his assistant moving cargo, Brody talking to the locomotive engineer, the family with their luggage, and the particular controlled chaos of people boarding with children. She was aware of Silas seeing her. He looked once, directly, and then looked away. She didn't make anything of it. She wasn't there for him. She was there because this platform was the first ground she had ever stood on in Black Creek, and she wanted to stand on it on a morning when she had nothing to prove and no one to answer to and nowhere she was running from. She wanted to feel the difference between that November afternoon and this April morning and know the difference was real, not something she'd constructed in memory to make the story better. It was real. It was completely, specifically real. The woman who had arrived here had been shaking inside her coat while she tried to appear capable. She had been looking at a stranger on a crowded platform and calculating whether he was the kind of man who would use her circumstances against her. She had been carrying the accumulated weight of 2 years of being defined by someone else's account of who she was, and she had been so tired of it that the tiredness had become structural, built into how she stood, how she breathed, what she expected from mornings. She was not that woman this morning. She was tired in the ordinary way of someone who had worked hard all winter. She had things to do today and tomorrow and next week. She had people she would see on Thursday, and a letter from Ruth Carver she needed to answer, and a fence repair she'd promised to help with on Saturday, and an account ledger that was behind by 2 days because the April correspondence had gotten away from her. She had a life. Not a complicated philosophical statement about the nature of belonging, just a life. The daily, specific, unspectacular content of it. The locomotive's whistle sounded. The signal that boarding was closing, that departure was imminent. She watched the family get their last piece of luggage situated, the children suddenly obedient in the way children became when the thing was actually happening. She watched Silas Grady board without looking back, which she had not expected to find poignant, and did slightly, because she was human, and humans were complicated, and the sight of any person leaving a place they'd built their life in, for whatever reason, carried its own weight, regardless of what you thought of them. The locomotive exhaled its long breath of steam. The platform shuddered once, subtly, under her feet. She watched the train leave. When it was gone, when the sound had faded to the distance and the platform had resettled into its ordinary self, she stood for another moment in the clear April light and thought about the specific things she had learned this year that she hadn't been able to learn in all the years before it. She had always believed, somewhere underneath everything, that belonging was something other people granted you, that you arrived somewhere and waited for the judgment and either received acceptance or you didn't, and the outcome depended on factors largely outside your control. Who you knew, what story preceded you, whether the people in power chose to be generous or not. She had believed this because it had been functionally true for most of her life. She had watched it be true. She had been on the wrong end of it when it wasn't. What Black Creek had taught her, what this particular difficult, unglamorous year had actually demonstrated in practice, was that belonging was not granted. It was built. Slowly, through the accumulation of small, true things, showing up when it wasn't required, being useful without being asked, saying accurate things with your name behind them, staying when staying was harder than leaving. Not perfectly. Not without mistakes or bad days or moments when she'd handled something poorly and had to go back and handle it better. But consistently enough that the weight of her presence in this place had become something the place had organized itself around, the way water found the level of whatever container it was in. She had built something here. It was imperfect and incomplete and would require maintenance for as long as she was in it. That was not a flaw. That was just what built things were. Brody came out of the station office as she was turning to go. "Mrs. Bennett." He had, over the months, developed a specific nod for her. Not the performative courtesy nod he gave to strangers, but the nod you gave to someone who was simply part of the landscape of your working days. "You see the freight notice? Supply window moved up 2 weeks. End of April instead of mid-May." She filed this immediately. "That'll affect the spring orders for half the ranches in the area." "That's what I figured." He said it with the tone of a man who was mentioning a problem in the direction of someone he expected to have thoughts about it. She did have thoughts about it. She had been tracking supply timing against consumption patterns for 4 months across 6 different operations, and she could see immediately what an earlier window meant for the smaller ranches that had less flexibility in their ordering. "I'll put something together," she said. "A consolidated order proposal. If we coordinate across properties, we can negotiate better terms, and nobody gets caught short." He nodded. "Figured you might." He went back to his office. She stood on the platform for one more moment. The tracks ran east and west from where she stood, east toward Philadelphia, toward the life she had left, toward the banker who had unmade her reputation, and the friends who had stopped answering letters, and the small, careful world she had built and lost. West toward the open country, the still partially unmapped distances, the kind of future that didn't have a shape yet. She was not going east. She was not, in any meaningful sense, going anywhere. She was going home, which was a 20-minute drive through spring mud on roads she knew by now well enough to navigate in the dark. She was going home to a ranch that needed fence work, and a husband who was probably already making something inadequate for lunch, and a stack of correspondence that wouldn't answer itself, and a life that was not finished or settled or resolved in the clean way that stories sometimes implied lives could be. She got in the wagon. She turned the horses west and drove. Colt was not making lunch when she got back. He was at the table with a piece of paper and a pencil, working through something with the concentration of a man who found arithmetic more difficult than fence repair, but was committed to managing his own affairs. He looked up when she came in. "How was it?" he asked. No elaboration needed. "Quiet," she said. He left without looking back. He set the pencil down. "You all right?" She thought about the question honestly, which she did with most questions now. Yes, she said. Not in a... It's not triumphant, but yes. He nodded. She hung up her coat and came to look at what he was doing. He slid the paper toward her without being asked, because by now he knew she would look anyway, and the paper was easier than explaining. It was a rough calculation for the North Pasture expansion, acreage, fencing materials, estimated cost against the easement payment. She sat down and looked at it. Your materials estimate is about 15% low, she said. Prices have gone up since winter. I have the current figures in the ledger. I figured. He didn't seem discouraged by this. Worth doing still? Yes. She found a fresh piece of paper and began working the correct numbers. The east half this year, north half in the fall if the summer is decent. You don't have to do it all at once. He watched her work. She was aware of his watching and didn't find it uncomfortable the way she once might have. The attention of someone who looked at you because you were genuinely interesting to them, which was a different thing entirely from the attention of someone assessing whether you were useful or threatening or in the way. Brody told me the supply window moved, she said without looking up. I heard this morning. It'll hit Carver's operation hard. I'm going to put together a consolidated order proposal. Coordinate across the ranches that I keep accounts for. Better negotiating position, nobody gets caught short. He was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was paying attention. How long will that take? A week, maybe less. She finished the column and totaled it. There. That's more accurate. He looked at the number. Still worth doing, he said. Yes, she agreed. Still worth doing. She set the pencil down and looked at the kitchen. The particular morning light through the east window, the coffee pot that needed refreshing, the domestic geography of a place that had become so familiar that she stopped seeing it in the way of a person cataloging an unfamiliar room and started seeing it in the way of a person who simply knew where everything was. There was something she had been thinking about since the station. Not a revelation. She was suspicious of revelations, which tended to be feelings dressed up in the language of conclusions. More just an observation she wanted to say out loud, because she had learned that saying things out loud was how she found out whether they were true or only seemed true. I used to think that if I could get somewhere far enough from what happened, I could leave it behind, she said. Just outrun it. Find a place where it hadn't arrived yet. Colt looked at her. It doesn't work that way, she said. I know that now. It came with me. The reputation and the fear and the habit of expecting to be judged before I'd done anything to deserve it. I brought all of it. The distance didn't change what I was carrying. What did? He asked. She thought about it. Having to put it down in order to do something else, she said. You can't haul water and hold on to all that at the same time. You have to choose. She paused. I chose the water. He looked at her for a long moment with that expression she had finally given up trying to translate into simpler terms and had decided to simply accept as his, the expression of a man who felt things deeply and had learned to be quiet about it, and occasionally, very occasionally, let the quiet slip. That's the most you've said about it, he said. I know. She picked up her pencil again. I think I needed the spring to say it. He reached across this table and briefly covered her hand with his. The same gesture as that December night at the station, the same quick grip that meant I hear you and I mean it, rather than anything softer or more elaborate. And then let go and stood up and said, I'll start on the east fence after lunch. I'll have the supply proposal drafted by Thursday. Good. He went to the stove to assess the lunch situation, which turned out to be as inadequate as she'd predicted, and she let him manage it because there were things he was better at than her, and things she was better at than him, and lunch was firmly in his column even when the results were modest. She turned back to the numbers on the table. Outside, the April day was warming up the way it had promised it would. Through the east window, she could see the south field, the grass coming in, the creek glinting where it bent around the property line. The horses were visible in the paddock, moving with that spring energy that was almost comic in animals so large. She thought about the woman who had stepped off a train in November with a worn suitcase and nowhere left to go, and she thought about who that woman had become in the months since, and she did not think the distance between the two was a triumph. It was work. It was the specific, daily, unglamorous work of deciding what kind of person you were going to be in the circumstances you actually found yourself in, as opposed to the circumstances you wished you had. She had not become someone new. She was still the woman who organized things under pressure, who held on to anger longer than was useful, who sometimes forgot to share information she should have shared, who found physical labor more satisfying than she'd expected, and small-town social dynamics more complicated than she'd anticipated. She still had bad nights sometimes. When the old Philadelphia weight settled back in and the distance between who she was and who that banker had said she was felt less certain than it did on good days. But she was also someone who kept accounts for 6 ranch operations and had organized a coal recovery in a blizzard and stood on a platform in front of an entire town and said the true thing with her name behind it. She was someone who had a husband who meant what he said, and a Thursday gathering where her presence was assumed, and a station master who came to her with supply problems because he expected her to have thoughts about them. She was, in the specific and particular sense of the word, someone who belonged here. Not because it had been granted, not because anyone had decided she deserved it, because she had built it, piece by piece, out of the ordinary materials of daily life, usefulness and consistency and the willingness to stay when staying was harder. That was the thing about belonging that she had not understood until she had it. It felt less like arriving and more like realizing you'd been somewhere for a while and stopped waiting to be asked to leave. Colt set a plate down beside her accounts without ceremony, the way he did everything. Directly, without performance. She picked up her fork. "Thank you," she said. "It's just bread and salt pork," he said, sitting down across from her. "I know," she said. "Thank you anyway." He looked at her across the table, this man who had picked up her suitcase on a cold platform and not asked her to explain herself, and had kept not asking her to explain herself for 6 months, and there was something in his face that was not quite a smile, but was in the same family as one, the expression of a person who had what they needed and knew it, and didn't feel the need to make more of it than it was. Outside, the spring day continued. The horses moved in the paddock. The creek ran fast with the melt. And Evelyn Mercer Bennett, who had arrived in Black Creek with nothing left to lose and had somehow, without entirely planning it, built a life worth protecting. She ate her lunch and worked her numbers and listened to the sound of the ranch settling into another ordinary day, and found that ordinary was, in the end, the thing she had been looking for all along. Not rescue, not vindication, not the clean cinematic moment of being publicly recognized as right. Just this. Just the work and the presence and the ground under her feet that she had earned day by day without anyone giving it to her. That was enough. That was, she had come to understand, exactly enough.